You can just call me Nellie. I'm 30, from a sleepy southern province called Sok Trang. And my dad, well, he was a strict old-school electrician who loved me to death but was tough as nails. Anyway, this whole thing traces back to a really bizarre irony in my life. I had this crippling phobia of dogs after getting bitten as a little kid, like full-on panic attacks if I saw one on the street. But somehow, surviving the absolute worst night of my life back in middle school was the exact thing that made me obsessed with them. It all started when I was just going into 7th grade. In my hometown, the schools were all separated by age groups, so the elementary, middle, and high schools were completely different campuses, scattered a few miles apart. My dad, being the incredibly calculating and protective guy that he was, decided to pick up a second job, doing evening electrical maintenance over at the local high school. He didn't even need the money. He just wanted to get on a first-name basis with the security guards, the janitors, the teachers, and the principal, so that by the time I was old enough to go there, he'd have the path completely paved for me. So, one evening, he picked me up from my middle school and took a detour. Instead of taking the right turn to go home, he hooked a left toward the high school, mumbling something about needing to swap out some bad starters on those old, flickering fluorescent tube lights in the hallways. It was probably around 6:15 or 6:20 p.m., and the sun was already dipping low, casting these long, stretched-out shadows across the concrete courtyard. The security guard had apparently stepped out for dinner, so the entire massive U-shaped campus was completely abandoned. My dad parked his bike, handed me my backpack, and told me to just sit on this cold stone bench right next to the guardhouse at the main gate. He strictly told me not to wander off, saying he'd be in and out in maybe 20 minutes, and then he'd take me to get ice cream. I just sat there, swinging my legs, feeling that heavy, humid evening air settling in. It was so incredibly boring that I just started scanning the buildings, trying to figure out the layout of where I'd be studying in a few years. I looked past the dark classrooms on the first floor, and my eyes naturally drifted toward the far end of the right wing where the bathrooms were. Because the campus was so huge, I really had to squint, but I could make out the signs for the boys' and girls' restrooms sitting side by side. As I was staring at the girls' bathroom, I saw the heavy wooden door slowly creak open, just about 2 hand widths wide. I immediately stopped swinging my legs. Somebody poked their head out from the dark gap, but their hair was so long and unkempt that it completely covered their face, falling like a thick black curtain. The person kind of peeked to the left, lingered for a second, and then pulled their head back in, and the door softly clicked shut. My 12-year-old brain immediately started running the denial loop. I completely convinced myself that it was just some rebellious high school girl who had skipped class and was hiding in the bathroom to smoke. Or maybe she was just waiting for her strict parents to pass by so she could sneak out to hang with her boyfriend. Stuff like that happened all the time. I kind of chuckled to myself, feeling like I had just busted someone's secret. But then, a couple of minutes later, I suddenly had to pee. Normally, the thought of walking into a dark, empty school bathroom would freak me out, but my dad was literally somewhere in the building fixing the lights. I felt this weird sense of ownership, like, my dad practically works here. I have every right to use the restroom. So I hopped off the bench and started making the long walk across the empty courtyard. I pushed open the heavy main door to the girls' room, stepping into that familiar smell of cheap industrial bleach and damp concrete. There was a second set of swinging doors leading to the actual stalls. I just picked the very first stall, not wanting to go too deep into the room, and did my business without a second thought. When I came out, I walked over to the long row of sinks near the main entrance to wash my hands. The only light in the room was whatever the setting sun was bleeding through the open doorway behind me, casting this murky grayish tint over the mirrors. I had my head down, scrubbing my hands under the faucet, when I heard this agonizingly slow, grinding creak of rusted metal hinges coming from the stall right behind me. The sound was so unnatural that the hair on my arms stood straight up before my brain even processed it. I slowly turned my head, dripping water all over the floor, and looked back at the stalls. It was the girl. She had pushed the stall door open and was leaning her head out, exactly like she did earlier. Her left hand was gripping the edge of the wood, and her long, stringy black hair was still draping over her face. She slowly turned her head to the left, as if checking the room, and then she turned her head to the right, stopping perfectly to face me. We were standing maybe 10 feet apart. I couldn't breathe. I was completely frozen, my mind desperately trying to figure out why this high schooler was acting so weird. Then she slowly raised her right hand, reached up to her face, and deliberately tucked the thick curtain of hair behind her ear. My stomach violently dropped. I felt all the blood rush out of my head in a single second. She didn't have a face. There were no eyes. There was no nose. There was no mouth or eyebrows or cheekbones. It was just a blank, fleshy slab of skin that was unnervingly smooth, almost like the bottom of a hot iron, but it had these horizontal wrinkled creases running across it, exactly like the folds on the palm of a human hand. She was intentionally showing it to me. She moved her head slightly, as if she was proudly displaying this sickening, unnatural void where a human face should be. Before I could even open my mouth to scream, the massive wooden door at the main entrance slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending this unnatural, freezing gust of wind slapping violently against my back. The entire bathroom went pitch black. Total, suffocating darkness. I completely lost my mind. I hurled myself at the main door, screaming at the top of my lungs, slamming my tiny fists against the wood so hard I could feel my knuckles bruising. I was shrieking for my dad, begging for someone to help me. Just pure, primal panic tearing up my throat. I was so terrified of whatever was standing behind me in the dark that my brain just short-circuited, and I passed out cold on the wet tiles. I don't know how long I was out, maybe a few minutes, but I woke up gasping for air, the image of that blank, fleshy palm face searing into my mind, and the panic immediately spiked again, making me pass out a second time. It was this agonizing loop of waking up in the dark, remembering the horror, and my body just shutting down to protect itself. Eventually, through the haze, I heard a muffled voice from outside. It was my dad. He was pacing around the courtyard, calling my name, sounding annoyed at first, and then increasingly frantic. I dragged myself up against the door and started sobbing, screaming that I was right there, that I was locked in the bathroom. I heard his heavy work boots jogging closer, stopping right on the other side of the door. I heard him grab the handle and aggressively jiggle it. I was screaming so hard my throat tasted like blood, begging him to open the freaking door and save me, but he just sighed. He mumbled out loud, wondering if the janitor had locked the bathroom and where the hell I could have wandered off to. We were inches apart, separated by maybe an inch of cheap wood, and he couldn't hear a single sound I was making. It was like the bathroom had been completely sucked into a vacuum, entirely cut off from the reality he was standing in. I heard his footsteps fade away as he went to check the boys' bathroom next door, and that's when the sheer hopelessness broke me. I collapsed on the floor and lost consciousness again, and this time, I was out for a long time. What I found out later was that my dad had panicked. He couldn't find me anywhere on the grounds, and he remembered hearing the local rumors about the school being severely haunted. In a desperate move, he sprinted back to our neighborhood, didn't even tell my mom what was happening because she would have killed him, and borrowed a massive black dog from our neighbor. Now remember, I was deathly afraid of dogs. But my dad knew that dogs could see things we couldn't, and black dogs specifically were known in our culture to aggressively ward off spirits. He rode his bike back to the school with the dog balancing on the front. He said the absolute second he kicked the kickstand down, the dog bolted. It sprinted in a straight line across the courtyard, beelining directly for the girls' bathroom, and immediately started viciously scratching at the door, letting out these deep, guttural barks that echoed off the walls. My dad ran over, grabbed the handle, and it was still locked tight. But the dog wouldn't stop going crazy at the wood. My dad finally realized I was in there, trapped by something he couldn't see. He completely lost his temper, grabbed a heavy hammer and a screwdriver from his tool belt, and just violently smashed the wooden door handle to pieces until the door splintered open. The light flooded in. I was lying on the floor, barely breathing, completely drained of life. He scooped me up, threw me on his bike, and rushed me home. I ran a brutal fever for days. My dad quit the maintenance job immediately. He later found out from the older staff that years ago, before the school had even built the second floor, a senior girl had gotten pregnant, was abandoned by her boyfriend, and had hung herself in that exact bathroom stall. When the government funded the school expansion, they built upward, but they never changed the layout of the ground floor. That girl's despair was permanently anchored to those tiles, and for whatever reason, she decided to show herself to me. And from that day forward, my paralyzing fear of dogs completely vanished. A dog had literally broken through a paranormal barrier to find me when my own father couldn't even hear my screams. I was completely obsessed with them, but the bitter irony was that my dad, who was so deeply traumatized by seeing my leg chewed up when I was a toddler, absolutely refused to let me own one. The rule was set in stone, and as he got older, he only got more stubborn. Fast forward almost 2 decades. I was a grown woman, freshly married. My dad was so overprotective that he basically forced my husband to move into our family home, acting like an absolute tyrant. He was the definition of an old-school patriarch. His house, his rules. About 6 months into our marriage, my husband, not fully grasping the absolute sheer terror of my dad's temper, brought home a fluffy white rescue pup that we named Banjo. All hell broke loose. My dad screamed that dog hair was going to ruin the house, that we were filthy, and he gave us an ultimatum. Either the dog goes, or we get the hell out of his house. For me, this was my one chance in a lifetime to finally have a dog. I looked at my husband, and we made the insane decision to leave. We were dead broke. We actually had to sell my wedding gold just to afford the deposit on a crumbling tiny rental room about 500 meters away from my family home. It was a claustrophobic little box. We parked our motorbike inside on the ground floor, where Banjo would sleep underneath it, and my husband and I slept up on a cramped wooden loft. Almost immediately, things felt incredibly wrong. During our very first week, we'd be trying to sleep on the loft, and we'd hear this distinct clanking sound coming from the tiny kitchenette right below us. It sounded like someone slowly lifting the metal spatulas and pans and letting them drop onto the counter. My husband just brushed it off, totally rationalizing it. He kept saying it was probably just mice, or maybe Banjo was bumping into the pots while wandering around in the dark. He even promised to buy a drill and hang all the pans high up on the wall the next day. But the next night, the noise happened again. I leaned over the loft railing and looked down into the dark. Banjo wasn't wandering around at all. She was crammed as far back under the motorbike engine as she could possibly fit, shaking. I just told myself she was a sensitive breed, probably just spooked by a rat. You have to understand, when you sacrifice everything and sell your wedding jewelry just to live somewhere, your brain absolutely refuses to admit that the place is fundamentally screwed up. But then Banjo started acting out. She went from being this sweet, obedient pup during the day to an absolute nightmare at night. She would stare into the dark corners of the room and bark aggressively for hours. The neighbors started banging on our walls, threatening to complain to the landlord. My husband would get so frustrated he'd go down and physically smack her to make her quiet down. Things peaked a few days later when my husband caught a brutal fever. We had no money for a hospital, so he was just sweating it out on the loft mattress, burning up at like 39 or 40 degrees Celsius. Sometime deep in the night, maybe around 2:43 a.m. or something, he was groaning that his body was on fire. I climbed down the steep wooden ladder to boil some water so I could wipe him down with a damp towel. I didn't turn on the main lights, just the tiny bulb over the kitchen sink, leaving the staircase area completely shrouded in heavy shadows. While I was waiting for the water to boil, Banjo started growling viciously from under the bike, staring directly at the stairs. I hissed at her to shut up, terrified she was going to wake up my sick husband. As I wrung out the wet towel, I glanced over at the staircase and saw a tall, dark silhouette slowly walking down the steps. I instantly assumed it was my husband. I felt this surge of annoyance and pity. I told him to just go back upstairs, warning him that the stairs were steep, and if he passed out and broke his arm, we literally couldn't afford a cast for him. The figure didn't answer. It just kept walking down in absolute silence, and the dog was going absolutely ballistic now, barking so hard she was choking on her own spit. I turned back to the sink for a split second to grab the bowl of water. When I turned around to tell my husband to go back to bed, there was nobody there. The figure had stepped off the bottom stair and just ceased to exist. A cold sweat broke out over my entire body. I gripped the bowl so hard my fingers ached, and I practically scrambled up the ladder, desperate to get back to the safety of the mattress. I sat down next to my husband and immediately started wiping his forehead with the cold towel. He groaned, shifted his weight, and weakly complained, asking me why the hell I had been pacing back and forth, stepping over his body for the last 20 minutes. He said I kept kicking his legs every time I stepped over him, and his joints were already aching from the fever. My heart completely stopped. I stared at him in the dim light, my voice trembling as I told him I had been downstairs boiling water the entire time. I only stepped over him once when I left the bed. He looked at me, his feverish eyes widening slightly, and then he just stayed completely silent. We both knew right then there was a ghost pacing around our loft, and it had stepped right over his sick body. The very next day, the energy in the room turned violently hostile. Banjo was pacing around like she had rabies. She was so stressed out that she literally chewed the rubber grips off the motorbike handles and shredded our laundry. I was so exhausted and terrified that I actually spanked her really hard, yelling at her that she was the reason we were trapped in this awful place. I still hate myself for doing that. That night, my husband was recovering, finally sleeping deeply. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when Banjo started barking downstairs again. I banged on the floorboards, telling her to shut up. She went quiet for a bit, but then the sounds changed. It wasn't just barking anymore. It sounded like a brutal, chaotic struggle coming from the tiny bathroom on the ground floor. I heard plastic buckets being thrown around, crashing against the tiles, and Banjo letting out these high-pitched, desperate yelps, like she was fighting for her life against a rabid animal. It went on for nearly 30 minutes, and I am so deeply ashamed to admit this, but I was too absolutely terrified to climb down those stairs and check on her. I just hid under the blanket, silently praying for morning to come. When the sun finally came up, my husband and I rushed downstairs. The sight made my stomach heave. The entire ground floor was covered in tufts of white fur. It looked like a pillow had exploded. I slowly pushed the bathroom door open, and there was Banjo. She was lying perfectly still on the wet, filthy tiles, her head resting on her paws, panting heavily with her tongue lolling out. She looked up at me, her eyes completely exhausted, and pleading. The plastic buckets were shattered. Soap powder was everywhere, and smeared across the floor, mixing with the water, were thick, swirling streaks of fresh blood. I dropped to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. When I reached out to touch her, I saw the extent of the damage. Someone, or something, had violently ripped massive clumps of fur right off her body. There were huge, raw pink patches of exposed skin on her neck, her thighs, and her lower back. It didn't look like bite marks. It looked like a pair of human hands had grabbed her fur by the roots and forcefully ripped it out of her flesh. My husband and I wrapped her in a blanket and sprinted to the only vet clinic in town. The veterinarian took one look at Banjo's injuries and then looked at us with absolute, thinly veiled disgust. He heavily implied that we were abusing our pet, bluntly stating that dog fights leave puncture wounds and tears, not perfectly plucked bald patches. He essentially accused us of torturing her. We didn't even try to argue. We just paid for the stitches and the medicine and left her there to be hospitalized for a few days. Going back to that empty, violated rental room that night broke me. We sat in the dark, listening to the pipes rattle, and I couldn't take it anymore. I completely broke down, crying so hard I couldn't breathe, and begged my husband to let me call my dad. I dialed his number and just bawled into the receiver. I told him everything: the shadow, the footsteps, the brutal attack on Banjo. I fully expected him to scream at me, to tell me I deserved it for disobeying him. Instead, he just went completely quiet and said he was on his way. 30 minutes later, He was standing at our door. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He just looked around the oppressive little room and ordered us to pack our bags immediately. He told us to forget the deposit, forget the money, and just get out. And then he gruffly mumbled that once the dog was healed, we could bring her to the house and he'd help us build a pen for her. I hugged him so tight. It was the first time I had hugged him like that since I was a little girl running out of that haunted school bathroom. We got out of there, and eventually, things went back to normal as they can be. My dad even secretly started feeding banjo sausages from the dinner table when he thought I wasn't looking, which is a miracle in itself. But I need to ask you guys something, because this question has been eating me alive for years. Can a ghost actually, physically tear chunks of flesh and fur off a living creature? Have you ever heard of a haunting that leaves that kind of physical, bloody proof? Drop a comment if you know anything, because I still wake up in cold sweats wondering, what would it have done to me if it hadn't taken its anger out on my dog? Thanks for listening to me ramble about my messed up life choices. Please, trust your pets when they stare into the dark, and stay safe out there. If you're driving for a rideshare app right now, especially if it's past midnight, do me a favor and pull over for a second. Turn off the engine. Just listen. I'm telling you this not to scare you, but as a warning from a guy who learned the hard way. The things I experienced driving my motorbike back in the early 2000s. Man, it's not just some spooky campfire story. It's a goddamn survival guide, because the dark corners of this city haven't changed. They just got better at hiding. Look, I need to give you some context so you understand that I am not, and have never been, a superstitious guy. Back in my hometown, when I was a teenager, I was that reckless idiot who would go out into the local graveyards in the pitch black just to catch field mice. I didn't care about spirits or curses or any of that crap. I was tough, I was stubborn, and I thought the physical world was the only thing that could actually hurt you. Then, my wife Brianna and I moved to Saigon around 2002 to try and make a living. She got a job in a garment factory, working herself to the bone. And well, my temper meant I couldn't hold down a regular job. I couldn't handle bosses breathing down my neck. So, out of sheer desperation, Brianna convinced her family back home to sell a small plot of land just so we could buy a decent Japanese wave motorbike. The plan was simple. I was going to be a motorbike taxi driver, a two-wheeled cab basically. If you think driving an Uber is stressful now, you have no idea what the streets were like back then. It was an absolute jungle. There were no apps, no GPS, just pure territorial warfare. The first 3 or 4 days I tried to work, I came home with my face completely bruised and battered. I'd try to park at a busy intersection or near a bus station, and the local turf gangs, the older drivers who claimed that corner, would literally throw rocks at my bike or just walk up and punch me in the jaw to chase me away. It was humiliating. It was a brutal, exhausting way to scrape by. So, I had to adapt. I realized I couldn't compete during the day, so I switched to the night shift. I started sneaking around, parking in the dark alleys near Tudu Hospital after 9 or 10 p.m. By that time, the city calmed down. The aggressive drivers went home to sleep, and I could actually pick up fares from people leaving the hospital late. And you know what? The money was surprisingly good. I was making a couple of extra bucks a night, which back then was enough for Brianna and me to stash away some solid savings. I felt like I had beat the system. I felt invincible. And then, the 7th lunar month rolled around. Over here, it's known as Ghost Month. It's a time when locals believe the gates of the afterlife just swing wide open and the dead walk among the living. Brianna begged me to stay home. She kept nagging me, telling me it was bad luck to be out on the streets so late during that month. But I just laughed in her face. I told her she was being ridiculous, that this was the best time to make money because all the religious folks were out going to temples and they always tipped better. I was so greedy and so incredibly blind. The first 2 weeks of that month, nothing happened. It was totally fine. I felt so vindicated. But then came the 14th night of the lunar month, the exact peak of the ghost festival. I was parked near a bus stop right outside Tudu Hospital. It was a weirdly slow night. I mean, it was dead. I had bought a thick police newspaper, and I just lay back on the seat of my bike, reading that thing cover to cover under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. By the time I checked my watch, it was around, I want to say 12:05 or 12:07 a.m. The streets were completely empty. The silence was heavy, like the thick, humid air was actually pressing down on my eardrums. I was just about to give up and head home, completely frustrated that I hadn't made my quota. Just as I shifted my weight to sit up, I heard this sound. It was the distinct, rhythmic shuffling of someone carrying heavy, clunky plastic bags, like the kind of bags people use when they bring food and supplies to a relative staying in the hospital. I opened my eyes and saw this man walking toward me out of the shadows. He looked completely exhausted. His clothes were all wrinkled and dirty. His hair was a mess. As he got closer, I noticed something else. Trailing right behind him was a little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. The kid looked exactly like the man. You could instantly tell they were father and son, but the boy was barefoot, and his clothes were covered in these dark, filthy smudges. I asked the man where he needed to go. He mumbled that he needed a ride all the way to Tanque Street, which was a pretty far haul from where we were. I told him it was going to cost about 40,000 dong, maybe $2, which was a very fair price for a night ride back then. He started negotiating, begging me in this tired, raspy voice to drop it to 35,000 because that was literally all the money he had left in his pockets. I looked at him, then looked at the barefoot kid standing quietly behind him, and I just felt a pang of pity. I agreed to the lower fare. I kicked the stand up and straddled the bike. The man climbed onto the back seat, but the weirdest thing happened next. The little boy didn't get on the back with his dad. He just silently climbed up and sat right in front of me, straddling the space between my arms and the handlebars. Usually, kids only sit up front like that if the back seat is completely packed with passengers. But since it was just the dad riding back there, he had plenty of room. I told the kid to scoot to the back with his dad, because it was dangerous up front. But the boy just sat there, stiff as a board, staring straight ahead. I looked back at the father, expecting him to say something, but the man just sat there in complete silence. He didn't even acknowledge what I said. So I figured, whatever, it's late, I just want to get this over with. I started the engine, and we took off into the dark streets. The wind was whipping past us, and I could see the little boy's hair blowing wildly in the breeze. It was so incredibly tactile, so physically real. I tried to make small talk, just to break the awkward silence. I asked the guy over my shoulder why he dragged his little boy all the way to the hospital so late at night instead of leaving him home. The man leaned in close to my ear, his voice sounding genuinely confused, and asked me what the hell I was talking about. He told me to stop joking around, because he was the only passenger on my bike. My heart did a massive drop into my stomach. I completely froze up. I didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. My brain just immediately went into overdrive, trying to rationalize it. I told myself he was just messing with me, or he was too tired to understand what I asked. I focused solely on the road, aggressively ignoring the little boy sitting mere inches from my chest. We finally pulled up to an old house on Tanque. The street was completely deserted, illuminated by this single, flickering fluorescent bulb. The man climbed off the bike and handed me a crumpled up wad of paper money. He told me to wait a second while he knocked on the door to wake his sister up, because he was afraid of getting mugged standing out there alone. He walked up to the door and started knocking, completely ignoring the kid. I couldn't take it anymore. I put the kickstand down, hopped off the bike, and yelled at the guy, asking him why he was leaving his son sitting on my bike. The man turned around, looked at me with this completely dead, flat expression, and calmly told me again that there was no kid. He pointed at my bike and told me to look for myself. I whipped my head around. The seat was completely empty. There was no little boy, no footprints, nothing. My knees instantly felt like they were made of water. I started shaking violently. I turned back to the man, stammering, demanding to know what the hell was going on because I swore to God I just drove his son halfway across the city. The man didn't look scared. He actually looked at me with this deep, sorrowful empathy. He took a slow breath and explained that his wife had a miscarriage early in the year and the baby hadn't survived. But ever since then, he said he felt this heavy, crushing weight pressing down on both his shoulders every single day. He had gone to a spiritual healer who told him that his unborn child's spirit was clinging to him. He refused to send the spirit to a temple because he wanted his son to stay with him. He said no one had ever actually seen the boy before, until tonight. He actually looked surprised and asked me if the boy had really sat in the front seat. Right at that moment, the front door swung open and his sister stepped out. She took one look at me, then looked at her brother, and started scolding him for taking a motorbike taxi in the middle of the night during the month of wandering souls. She literally said that picking up hitchhiking spirits was bound to happen. The man just shrugged, told me the spirit was attached to him and wouldn't follow me home, and then they just walked inside and slammed the door. They left me standing there alone on a pitch-black street at 1 a.m, my entire body violently shivering. I didn't even put my helmet back on. I just threw myself onto the bike and sped off, my mind completely fractured. I was so panicked that I took a wrong turn. Keep in mind, there were no smartphones back then. I was just blindly navigating through the dark, and I ended up totally lost, miles away from where I should have been, popping out onto Trung Chin Street in the Tan Binh district. The road was wide and mostly empty, save for a few cargo trucks roaring past. I needed to calm down. I was hyperventilating. I pulled over near a large gas station at a fork in the road. The place was well lit, which made me feel a tiny bit safer. I fumbled in my pockets, pulled out a cigarette, and ducked my head down to light it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely flick the lighter. I took 2 deep drags, the nicotine barely taking the edge off, when a voice right behind my shoulder asked if I was available for a ride. I jumped, nearly dropping the cigarette. I spun around and saw a young guy standing there. He looked maybe 19 or 20. He was wearing a faded button-down shirt, a pair of jeans, and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. But the thing that immediately sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my veins was that he was completely barefoot, just standing on the oily concrete without shoes. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hit the gas and leave, but the streetlights were bright, and my rational brain, the stupid, stubborn part of me, was trying to regain control. I figured he was just some junkie or a local thug who got into a fight and lost his shoes. I asked him where he wanted to go, keeping my voice as tough as possible. He muttered that he needed to go to Lang Cha Ka, which was a massive traffic roundabout a few miles down the road. I told him it would be 15,000 dong, less than $1. He nodded slowly and agreed. He climbed onto the back. I threw my cigarette away and merged back onto the main road. The street was wide and heavily illuminated, so my fear started to subside just a little bit. We were cruising at a decent speed, but as we got closer to the roundabout, I realized the area was huge, and I needed to know exactly where to drop him. I asked him over my shoulder if he wanted to be dropped off at the beginning of the roundabout or the far side. Total silence. I asked him again, raising my voice over the engine noise, telling him I needed a specific street name, or else I wouldn't know where to turn. Still nothing. Not a whisper. Not a shift in weight. I was so incredibly pissed off at this point. My nerves were absolutely shredded from the earlier incident, and now this punk was playing games with me. I slammed on the brakes and swerved roughly over to the curb. I planted my feet on the ground and twisted my body around, fully prepared to grab him by the collar and throw him off my bike. But when I looked at him, he was just sitting there, perfectly still. He had scooted as far back on the seat as possible. His hands were resting flat on his thighs, and his head was bowed, so low that the brim of his baseball cap completely hid his face. I lost my temper. I started yelling at him, cursing him out, telling him I wasn't playing his freaking games. I told him to give me 10,000 dong for the distance we covered and get the hell off my bike. I must have stood there for 2 solid minutes, screaming at a guy who refused to even flinch. While I was losing my mind, Another motorbike taxi driver, an older guy in a thick jacket, pulled up alongside me. He looked at me with disgust and started berating me, asking me why the hell I was driving around drunk during the ghost month, yelling at thin air like a lunatic. I snapped back at him, pointing furiously at my back seat, telling him I wasn't drunk. I was just trying to kick this stupid kid off my bike because he wouldn't tell me where to go. The old man squinted at my bike. He looked at me, then looked at the seat, his face suddenly dropping all its anger, replaced by this horrifying pale realization. He asked me, very quietly, what exactly I was carrying. I turned around to point at the kid's face. The seat was empty. There was absolutely no one there. I swear to God, the air in my lungs just vanished. I staggered backward, the bike almost falling over. I started babbling to the old man, telling him I just picked the kid up at the gas station down the road, describing his clothes, his hat, his bare feet. The old man slammed his hand against his handlebars. He swore loudly, asking me exactly where I picked him up. When I told him it was right at the tip of the concrete divider by the gas pumps, the old man went dead silent. He told me, in this low, trembling voice, that just a few days ago, a young guy matching that exact description was walking barefoot across that exact intersection and got absolutely pulverized by a speeding dump truck. The impact threw his body right into the concrete base of the gas station sign. The old man didn't let me drive home alone. He was terrified for me. He escorted me all the way back to my neighborhood, making sure I didn't stop or talk to anyone else. When I got home, I collapsed. I didn't drive for a solid week. I just stayed in my room, staring at the walls, trying to convince myself I had just hallucinated the entire night due to exhaustion. I should have quit right then. I really should have. But poverty is a stubborn thing. We needed the money, and eventually, the terror faded into a dull anxiety. I went back to work, but I was paranoid. A few months passed. It was December. The city was still recovering from a massive, horrific tragedy. The ITC commercial building had caught fire a couple of months prior, and a lot of people had burned to death trapped inside. It was a dark cloud over the whole city. One evening, around 8 p.m., I was parked on the sidewalk of Hoing Thuy Kang Street, standing around watching some older men play Chinese chess on a folding table. I had left my bike parked a few feet away. I was just killing time, minding my own business. One of the guys watching the game tapped my shoulder and pointed toward the street, grumbling that I had a customer waiting and I shouldn't ignore my job. I turned around and saw a young woman sitting side saddle on the back of my bike. She looked completely normal, an office worker wearing a nice blouse, dark slacks, and high heels, with her hair styled in those tight curls that were popular back then. She smiled politely, apologized for intruding, and asked if I could take her across the Calmet Bridge into District 4. I agreed immediately. 10,000 dong, which was less than $1 for a quick trip over the bridge. Easy money. I got on the bike and we headed toward the bridge. I was always a chatty driver, so I started making conversation, asking her why she was working so late. She politely replied that her office always had late hours. I asked her where her office was, and she gave me the name of the ITC building. The hair on my arms immediately stood up. I nervously chuckled, looking at her in the rearview mirror, and told her she must be mistaken, because that building had burned down a few months ago and nobody was working there. We were halfway up the steep incline of the Calmet Bridge. The wind was howling off the river. She looked at my eyes in the mirror. Her face completely twisted into a mask of pure agony. "Oh my God, the fire is everywhere," she screamed, her voice completely unhinged, tearing right through my eardrums. "The smoke is so thick, I can't see the stairs. It's burning my skin. God, it's so hot. I can't run. I can't run fast enough." She was thrashing wildly on the back of the bike, screaming at the top of her lungs about the flames melting her skin. I lost my fucking mind. Pure primal terror took over. My hands jerked violently, twisting the handlebars. The bike fishtailed out of control, and we both went slamming down onto the hard asphalt, tumbling over and over down the slope of the bridge. I scraped the flesh off my arms and knees. I scrambled up, completely bloody and fueled by pure adrenaline, ready to scream at this crazy woman for nearly killing us. I spun around, The bridge was completely empty. A couple of other drivers who had been behind me pulled over to help me pick up my bike. They looked at me like I was insane. They asked me why I had suddenly started violently swerving left and right before throwing myself onto the pavement. I frantically asked them where the girl in the office clothes went. They just stared at me. They told me I had been riding alone the entire time. I limped home that night, dripping blood on my floorboards, and swore to Brianna that I was done. I promised her I would never, ever take a fare past 6 p.m. again. And I kept that promise for almost a year. I became religious about it. If the sun was down, the engine was off. But then, late in 2003, I messed up. I let my greed win one last time. It was around 5:30 in the evening, right during peak rush hour. The traffic near the Phu Lam Bridge was a nightmare. An old woman carrying a ton of groceries waved me down. She wanted to go to a deep alleyway in Bin Tan district. It was a long ride, and I knew it would push me past my 6 p.m. curfew, but the traffic was so bad, I figured I'd be stuck anyway, so I might as well make 20,000 dong out of it. I took the fare. The old woman was a gossip, constantly talking into my ear the whole ride. As we finally approached her neighborhood, it was already well past 6:30, and the sky was completely dark. She pointed out a pair of houses in her alley. She whispered that a few months ago, a massive gas canister had exploded inside, burning both houses to a crisp and killing a handful of people sleeping inside. I drove past the houses. The stench of charred wood and burnt plastic was still suffocating. The walls were nothing but blackened, skeletal remains. I dropped the old woman off deep in the alley, took my money, and immediately turned around to speed out of there. I hated the vibe of that place. As I was driving back toward the main road, my headlight washed over the front of the burned-down houses. Standing right in front of the blackened rubble, just inches from the curb, was a young girl. She was wearing a simple shirt, and her hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her head was bowed so low her chin touched her chest, and she was slowly, methodically waving her hand at me, hailing a ride. My stomach tied itself into a freezing knot. My instincts, the ones honed by the hospital and the bridge, screamed at me. I didn't even look at her. I gunned the engine and flew past her, bursting out onto the busy main road. I pulled over, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sitting on a parked bike nearby was an old driver, fast asleep with a newspaper covering his face. I frantically shook him awake and told him there was a customer waiting right inside the alley. The old man woke up, thrilled to get a fare, and immediately revved his engine. He drove into the alley. I stood there on the main road, safely under a street lamp, and watched him ride toward the girl. I saw him slow down as he approached her, and then, clear as day, I watched the girl slowly drop her hand, turn around, and walk straight into the pitch-black, abandoned ruins of the burned house, disappearing into the shadows. A few seconds later, the old man came tearing out of the alley, his face purple with rage. He threw his bike on its kickstand and marched up to me, threatening to beat my skull in for playing a cruel prank on him. I held my hands up, terrified, and swore to him that I wasn't joking, that I saw a girl waving for a ride. In front of the burned house, the old man stopped dead in his tracks. All the color drained from his face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine horror, and asked me if she was standing in front of the ashes. When I nodded, he started shaking. He whispered, his voice cracking, that one of the victims of that fire was a 16-year-old girl from the countryside who had just moved to the city. He told me that ever since the fire, the night drivers had been reporting a young girl standing in that exact spot, trying to hire a bike to take her back to her home village in the Mekong Delta. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait around. I jumped on my bike and I drove home faster than I ever had in my life. From that second until the day I finally sold that bike in 2010, I never broke my rule again. I didn't care if it was a holiday. I didn't care if a customer offered me $100. If the clock struck 6, my engine was dead. Wow, I didn't realize how long I've been talking. My bad, guys. I get lost in my own head sometimes, but getting this out, it honestly feels like I can finally breathe a little easier. Thank you for your patience. It really means the world to me. For the drivers out there, hustling in the dark, watch your back. And if a passenger ever tells you they don't want to go home, don't ask them where they really belong. Stay safe, all right? This happened a long time ago, probably 15 or 16 years back, when I was in the 9th grade. I grew up in this really poor, isolated village way down south, far outside of Saigon. Our local middle school was what you'd call a true rural school. Up until the 8th grade, our classrooms literally had dirt floors and roofs made of woven leaves and cheap tin that would bake you alive in the summer. It was rough. But then, right before my 9th grade year, the government finally funneled some money down to our district to upgrade public facilities. It was a huge deal for us. They tore down the old shacks and built this actual solid concrete school with a real cafeteria and a massive courtyard for us to play soccer. Though it wasn't grass, just this hard, unforgiving cement that would tear your knees up if you fell. But here's the thing about government funding in those small towns. The money never quite stretches as far as it's supposed to. They managed to build the main classrooms and the yard, but they completely ran out of budget for the perimeter walls, the front gates, and the security guardhouse. Because the school year had already started, the principal decided they would just wait until the long Lunar New Year break to finish the fences. So, for the entire first half of my 9th grade year, our school was just this open, exposed concrete complex sitting in the middle of overgrown fields, completely accessible to anyone at any time of day or night. And man, we were absolute menaces. You have to understand, in a poor farming village where there's literally no entertainment, no tall buildings, no concrete structures at all besides the police station, a brand new, open school is like an amusement park for bored kids. Once the sun went down, me and all the other middle schoolers would sneak into the courtyard. We didn't have bad intentions at first, but you know how mob mentality works. It started with just playing soccer in the dark, and then it escalated to drawing crap all over the freshly painted walls, leaving our trash everywhere. And I'm actually ashamed to admit this, some of the really messed up kids would literally take a shit right on the classroom floors just to spite the teachers they hated. The school only had one janitor/security guard, this older guy named Trent. But Trent didn't have a guardhouse to sleep in, so he would just lock the classroom doors, beat the big ceremonial drum to signal the end of the day, and then he'd go home to his family. He'd try to come back at night to chase us out, but the second he turned his back, we'd just swarm right back in like roaches. It was a completely screwed up situation for the faculty. So, the principal got desperate. He pulled aside our PE teacher. Let's call him Tyler. Tyler was this brand new, fresh out of college guy, maybe 25 years old, tops. Honestly, looking back now, he was just a kid himself, younger than I am today. The principal basically forced Tyler to take on unpaid night guard duties alongside Trent, just to walk the perimeter until 10 p.m. and scare the kids away. Tyler was pissed. I mean, totally understandably. He was a young guy. He wanted to finish his shift, go out, drink some beers with his buddies, and smoke cigarettes at the local cafes, not babysit a bunch of feral preteens in the dark. So, Tyler, being the lazy but somewhat clever guy he was, came up with a psychological warfare tactic to keep us out. Since he taught physical education to every single class from 6th to 9th grade, he decided to use his class time to plant a seed. I still vividly remember the day he did it to our class. We were out in the blazing morning sun, sweating through our uniforms, when he suddenly cut the drills short about 30 minutes in. We were thrilled, obviously. He told us all to gather around him on the concrete, lowering his voice like he was letting us in on some massive, illegal secret. He told us that he cared about us too much to let us get hurt and that the principal was trying to cover up the dark history of the school. He explicitly warned us not to tell anyone else what he was about to say, which is the ultimate hook for a bunch of gossipy kids. Then he spun these incredibly elaborate, terrifying ghost stories. He told us that years ago, before the school was downgraded to a middle school, a 12th grade girl got her heart broken and hung herself from the rafters of the old thatched roofs. and that if you walked by the school at night, you could hear the sickening sound of a rope creaking and see her hanging body floating back and forth in the empty classrooms. But he didn't stop there. He told us another story about a kid who snuck into the school at night to sleep because he was running away from home. Tyler swore that the kid was targeted by an old dark entity that lived in the soil, and that the entity possessed him and forced him to walk in endless, mindless circles around the courtyard all night long, until the morning market vendors found him completely catatonic, his face pale and his mind just gone. He capped it off with a story about a previous security guard who drank himself to death on the job and still wandered the perimeter, offering poisoned fruit to anyone who trespassed. He delivered these stories with such deadpan, chilling sincerity. And you have to realize, to a bunch of superstitious, gullible 12 and 13-year-olds in a rural village, hearing an adult, a teacher, an authority figure, confirm that monsters are real, it was absolute gospel. It scared the living crap out of us. And his plan worked flawlessly. Within a week, the rumor spread like wildfire through the entire student body. Nobody, and I mean nobody, dared to step a single foot near that school after sunset. The place was like a graveyard. Tyler got praised by the administration for single-handedly solving the vandalism problem, and he got his nights back to go out drinking. It was the perfect lie. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. About a month passed. The stories became accepted facts, and the school remained completely abandoned at night. But I had this buddy. Let's call him Quinn. Quinn was that kid, the one who always had to push boundaries, the one who questioned everything, the one who was just a little too brave for his own good. We were hanging out at a local drink stand one evening, just chewing on sugarcane, when Quinn casually asked if I wanted to go into the school that night. I looked at him like he had lost his damn mind. I reminded him about the hanging girl, the dead guard, the entity that drags you in circles. But Quinn just scoffed. He told me he had been doing his own investigating. His older brother, who was already married and living in the city, had gone to that same school a decade ago. Quinn's brother confirmed that our school had never, ever been a high school. There were no 12th graders. And Quinn's mom, who sold vegetables at the morning market right next to the school, had never heard a single vendor talk about finding a catatonic kid walking in circles. In a village where everyone knows everything about everyone, a story like that wouldn't just be a secret. Quinn had figured it out. He knew Tyler was full of it. He looked at me with this smug grin and laid out his plan. He wanted us to go in, grab some chalk, and write our names all over the walls. He said that once the other kids saw our graffiti the next morning, they'd realize the ghosts were fake, and we'd have our nighttime hangout spot back before the fences got built after the holidays. I was terrified, honestly. My brain understood his logic, but my gut was just twisting itself into knots. But peer pressure at that age is a hell of a drug. Quinn essentially cornered me, telling me that I only had to stand by the entrance and keep watch, just so I could be his witness the next day to prove he went in. Like an idiot, I agreed. It was maybe around 8:30 p.m. when we finally walked toward the school. The village was already dead quiet. It was that specific type of rural darkness that feels heavy, like the shadows have actual physical weight to them. There were no streetlights, just the pale moonlight cutting through the tops of the coconut trees, casting these long, jagged shapes across the dirt road. When we got to the school, there was no gate, just two massive, unfinished concrete pillars sticking out of the ground like giant tombstones. Quinn walked right between them without hesitating. I stopped at the threshold. The silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was that high-pitched, ringing silence that makes your ears hurt. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching Quinn wander around the dark courtyard. The wind rustled the bamboo groves behind the cafeteria, and every time the leaves scraped together, my heart did a miserable little flip. I kept desperately trying to rationalize everything. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just a stray dog, just the buildings settling. My brain was working in overdrive to deny the sheer, primal bad vibe I was getting from the place. After about 10 minutes of absolutely nothing happening, the tension kind of broke. Quinn waved at me from across the yard, proving his point. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mixed with a little bit of embarrassment for being such a coward. I took a deep breath, crossed the threshold, and jogged over to him. Quinn whispered that we needed to go inside one of the actual classrooms to find some colored chalk. We walked down the open-air corridor of the 9th grade wing. The doors weren't padlocked, just pulled shut. Quinn reached out and pushed the door to classroom 9A1 open. The hinges gave this faint metallic squeal. We stepped inside. The room smelled like fresh concrete, dust, and cheap chalk. The moonlight spilled through the glassless window frames, illuminating the rows of empty wooden desks. We were just standing there, letting our eyes adjust to the gloom, when my entire reality just shattered. The silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard this slow, deliberate scraping sound from the classroom, right next door to ours, which immediately escalated into this deafening, violent, crashing noise. And I mean, it sounded literally like 10 full-grown men were just picking up heavy wooden desks and violently hurling them against the concrete walls over and over again, the wood splintering and the metal legs screeching against the floor in this chaotic, aggressive frenzy. It was so loud, the vibrations were traveling up through the soles of my cheap sandals. I didn't think. I didn't try to look through the window. I didn't try to rationalize it. I just experienced this pure, blinding surge of animal panic. I screamed. I didn't even yell words, just this guttural, pathetic noise, and I spun around and ran. I ran so freaking fast my feet barely registered the concrete. I didn't look back. I just blindly sprinted out of the classroom, across the courtyard, past the unfinished pillars, and down the dirt road toward my house. I was squinting my eyes. You know, that thing kids do when they're terrified, where they squint their eyes almost completely shut so they don't accidentally see a ghost while they're running? Yeah, I did that all the way to my front door. I just assumed Quinn was right behind me. I heard my own rapid footsteps and my own ragged breathing, and I just figured he was matching my pace. But when I slammed my front door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood and gasping for air, I realized I was alone. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I just lay in my bed, shaking, waiting for the sun to come up. The next morning, I went to school, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I immediately scanned the courtyard for Quinn. He wasn't there. He didn't show up for first period, or second. Our homeroom teacher noticed his absence. Back then, if a kid was sick for a few days, the whole class would organize a visit to their house. It was a whole formal thing. So, after school, our teacher led a group of us over to Quinn's place. When we got there, the atmosphere was completely wrong. It felt heavy. The teacher sat in the front room with Quinn's parents, sipping tea, while we were told to go to the back bedroom to see him. I remember looking at his parents' faces. They looked hollowed out, their eyes red and puffy, speaking in these hushed, shaky tones to the teacher. We all crowded into Quinn's room. He was lying on his bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the ceiling. The other kids were doing that fake, polite thing, asking him how he was doing, telling him they brought him some fruit. It was so agonizingly awkward. Quinn just gave these weak nods, not really focusing on anyone. Eventually, the other kids got bored and wandered out to the front yard. I stayed behind. I sat on the edge of his bed, my stomach doing backflips. I leaned in and asked him what the hell happened, why he didn't run with me. Quinn slowly turned his head to look at me, and his eyes, they just looked dead. He told me in a whisper that he didn't run away. He told me he was trapped in the school all night. I was so confused. I told him that made no sense, that I heard the crashing. I screamed and I ran, and I thought he was right on my heels. Quinn swallowed hard. He told me that when the crashing started, I bolted first. He was paralyzed for a second, but then he snapped out of it and tried to follow me. He ran out of the classroom door, squinting his eyes tight in the dark just like I did, but he only made it a few steps before he slammed chest first into a person. He bounced off and fell hard on his back. He scrambled to sit up, expecting to see me, or maybe Trent the security guard, or Tyler the PE teacher. But it wasn't them. Standing over him was a shadow. It was the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but it was entirely pitch black, darker than the night around them. Quinn was absolutely terrified. He thought it was Tyler catching us breaking in, so he started stammering out apologies, begging the teacher not to tell his parents. The shadow didn't say anything at first. It just reached down and grabbed Quinn's wrist. Quinn told me the grip was like a vice, cold and impossibly strong. It hoisted him up to his feet so violently it almost dislocated his shoulder. And then, the entity spoke. It didn't yell. It just uttered one word, over and over, in this flat, hollow frequency that vibrated right through Quinn's skull. Go, go, go. And it started walking, dragging Quinn along with it. Quinn was crying, begging, apologizing, pulling against the grip, but the entity didn't even flinch. It just kept saying, go, 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 dragging him across the courtyard, down the corridors, around the back of the cafeteria. Quinn told me they walked for hours. He was begging the entity to let him rest. His legs were giving out, but the grip never loosened. It was a physical impossibility. The schoolyard wasn't that big, but somehow they just kept walking in this endless, looping nightmare. Quinn's body eventually gave out. He said the exhaustion was unnatural, like his literal life force was being siphoned out of him through the entity's hand. He started convulsing, foaming at the mouth, fading in and out of consciousness. The last thing he remembered before completely passing out was the feeling of his own spit running down his chin and the relentless pulling on his arm. Trent found him the next morning at sunrise, unconscious, lying on top of a desk in the exact same classroom we had initially walked into. Hearing that, I felt like all the blood drained out of my body. The realization hit me like a freight train. Tyler's fake story. The entity that drags you in circles until you lose your mind. It wasn't just a story anymore. Quinn never came back to our school. His parents pulled him out and transferred him to a different district miles away. Tyler, the PE teacher, got quietly fired after Quinn's parents raised hell with the administration, though they couldn't exactly put summoned a demon on his termination papers. But the tragedy didn't end there. The trauma of that night completely broke Quinn. Over the next few months, he started acting erratic. He'd get these weird, manic episodes where he'd just stare at walls and giggle, or he wouldn't recognize me when I tried to visit him. His mind was just fracturing. And then, about 6 months later, Quinn was riding on the back of his dad's motorcycle, heading to the morning market. They were just cruising down a normal road, when Quinn suddenly had a massive freakout. He started screaming, thrashing around, and he just threw himself off the moving bike. He didn't hit the ground. He stumbled and fell directly into the path of another motorcycle coming from the opposite direction. The handlebar clipped him right in the throat. It wasn't even a high-speed crash, but it hit the exact wrong spot. Quinn died instantly, just like that. Gone. After his death, the entire village completely blew up. The rumor spread everywhere that the school actually had a real ghost. It became a massive deal, and the school administration had to step in to try and handle the panic. A bunch of students ended up transferring out of the school entirely because everyone was so terrified. But as for me, I stayed. I just kept going to that same school. By the time the next school year rolled around, they had finally finished building the perimeter walls and the front gates, so the place was actually secure. Plus, I was only scheduled for morning classes from then on. So, in the bright daylight with a proper fence, I just didn't feel scared of it anymore. I don't really like talking about my first marriage because it's a goddamn train wreck. I was 16, dumb, and obsessed with this guy who was basically the alpha of our small village in Haojiang. We got married way too young, and the second the honeymoon phase ended, he turned into a monster who thought my face was a punching bag. By the time I walked away at 22, I'd lost everything. My dignity, my jewelry, and even my own kid, because I didn't have a cent to my name. My in-laws basically snatched my baby because the law doesn't favor broke mothers. I just sat at the bus station in Saigon and cried until I couldn't feel my face, eating cold sweet potatoes just to survive. I honestly thought my life was just done. No plan, nowhere to go. I was basically just a zombie sitting on a sticky plastic bench, breathing in diesel fumes and feeling sorry for myself. And that was when my current husband found me. He was a long-haul driver, driving one of those massive, loud 2-ton delivery trucks, hauling bricks and construction materials all over the southern provinces. He saw me looking pathetic, offered me a ride, and I was so deeply depressed and exhausted that I didn't even care about my own safety anymore. I just climbed into his massive rig, figuring whatever happened to me couldn't be worse than what I had already been through. But instead of taking advantage of me, he was kind. He just drove, let me sleep, and eventually we just kind of clicked. We didn't even have a wedding or anything formal, you know? I had already done the whole traditional marriage thing and it almost killed me, so we just skipped the paperwork and moved into a tiny, cramped rental room together. He is the complete opposite of my ex. He is this stoic, incredibly quiet guy who shows his love through actions, not words. I mean, the man will literally go an entire evening without saying a single sentence to me, but he'll make sure my phone is charged and my favorite snacks are on the table. He is just a solid, good human being. After a few years of saving every single penny and living on practically nothing, we finally managed to buy a house. And when I say house, I mean a rundown, absolute bare-bones cinder block box in the deep suburbs of the city. It was one of those charity builds that the previous owner sold to us for cheap, and we still had to take out a massive bank loan to afford it. Anyone who has ever had a mortgage knows that the financial panic of paying the bank every month is infinitely more terrifying than living in a slum. We were stretched so thin that we had to cut corners everywhere. One of the ways we saved money was on gas. My husband's company paid for the diesel in his work truck, so instead of taking his motorbike for his hour-long commute into the city, he'd just drive the massive brick hauler all the way home and park it right in front of our tiny house. Our alley was just barely wide enough for it, and it blocked half the view, but we didn't care. It was free transportation. Because my shift ended earlier, my routine was always the same. I'd get home about 45 minutes before him, start the rice cooker, prep the vegetables, and listen for the heavy rumbling roar of his diesel engine pulling up. He had this cute little habit where he would walk straight through the front door, smelling like sweat and motor oil, and give me a huge kiss on the forehead before even taking his boots off. It was our little anchor of normalcy, until one evening, the routine just broke. I was in the kitchen, chopping garlic, when I heard the heavy rumble of his truck pull up outside. I heard the air brakes hiss, heard the engine cut off, and then nothing. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, then maybe 15 minutes passed, and the front door still hadn't opened. I wiped my hands on my apron, feeling this sudden spike of annoyance, and walked out to the front yard. The truck was parked there, but he wasn't coming inside. Instead, he was standing on the runner step with a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing furiously. But he wasn't washing the outside of the truck. He was leaning all the way into the cabin, aggressively scrubbing down the passenger seat and the floorboards. My stomach instantly did this horrible, ugly flip. When you've been betrayed as badly as I was in my past, your brain automatically jumps to the absolute worst-case scenario. I didn't think he was just doing chores. I immediately thought he had another woman in there. I mean, why else would a guy who hauls dirty bricks for a living suddenly care about scrubbing his passenger seat with a sponge? Did she spill perfume? Did she leave makeup on the dashboard? I marched up there and passive-aggressively asked him what the hell was so important that he couldn't come inside and say hi to his wife. He just looked at me, looking totally exhausted, and mumbled some weak excuse about the cabin getting muddy and how he was just doing a quick wipe down. He brushed it off so casually, telling me he was starving and asking if dinner was ready. I let it go, but the seed of doubt was already planted in my brain. Over the next week or so, he started having this bizarre string of bad luck. He came home one night, complaining that some lady on a scooter had backed right into his parked truck and smashed his turn signal, costing him a couple $100,000 to fix. A few days later, he was furious because he supposedly rolled over a jagged piece of glass in a totally clear parking lot, shredding his tire completely. He had to pay his company over $2 million, which was roughly $80, and a massive chunk of our grocery budget. He kept grumbling about how the truck felt cursed, how things just kept going wrong for no logical reason. I just thought he was having a bad week. I had no idea that the bad luck was actually a warning sign. About a week after the tire incident, we were dead asleep. Our house was a standard shotgun layout. Living room at the front, our bedroom in the middle, kitchen in the back. At around midnight, I was ripped out of a deep sleep by a sound outside. It was a rhythmic, metallic clicking. Click, clack, click, clack. I lay there in the dark, my brain groggy, trying to place the sound. It was loud. It was the heavy-duty hazard flashers from a commercial truck. And because our alley was a dead end, I knew for an absolute fact that my husband's rig was the only vehicle out there capable of making that sound. I nudged him, but he was completely passed out, snoring softly. The clicking just kept going, echoing against the concrete walls of our neighbors' houses. Click, clack, click, clack. I figured maybe the wiring was short-circuiting because of all the recent damage, or maybe the battery was going to drain and we'd be totally screwed for work the next morning. I dragged myself out of bed, annoyed and shivering a little because the night air was damp, and walked out to the living room. We had this cheap, semi-transparent mesh curtain over the sliding glass front door. I stood in the dark living room, peering through the fabric out into our small yard. The amber hazard lights of the truck were pulsing, illuminating the street in these harsh yellow flashes. And right as the light flashed on, I saw a silhouette in the passenger seat. I froze. My breath literally hitched in my throat. I squinted, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. But the light flashed again, and I saw it clearly. It was a person. A woman. She had long, stringy hair, and she was wearing a bright, almost neon-colored jacket that caught the amber light. But the creepiest part was how she was moving. She wasn't just sitting there. She was slumped down beneath the dashboard, and then she would slowly pop her head up to look out the windshield, and then duck back down, up and down, like a twisted game of hide and seek. If this were a movie, this is the part where the main character realizes it's a ghost and runs away screaming. But I am a fiercely jealous woman with severe trust issues. I didn't feel a drop of fear in that moment. I felt pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. All I could think was that my supposedly perfect husband had brought his freaking mistress home, hid her in the truck while I was asleep, and was probably planning to sneak out and hook up with her. I threw the front door open, marching barefoot across the concrete yard. The hazard lights were still flashing, blinding me every 2 seconds. As I got within a few feet of the passenger side door, the woman popped her head up again, but this time, she didn't look out the windshield. She turned her head, slowly, and looked directly past me, staring intensely at our front door. She looked like she was searching for something. Searching for him. That was the last straw. I completely lost my mind. I grabbed the handle of the truck door and yanked it, but it was locked. So I just started slamming my fists against the metal, screaming at the top of my lungs, cursing her out, demanding that the home-wrecking bitch show her face and fight me like a woman. I was banging on the glass so hard I thought it would shatter. The noise woke my husband. The front door of the house banged open, and he came running out in his boxers, looking totally panicked, asking me what the hell I was doing. I screamed at him to unlock the damn door, demanding he show me the girl he was hiding. He looked at me like I belonged in a psych ward, but he fumbled for his keys and unlocked the passenger door. I ripped it open, ready to drag whoever was in there out by their hair, but the cabin was completely empty. There was no one there. The space inside that truck is tiny, barely enough room for a small cooler between the seats. There was nowhere to hide. No secret compartments, just an empty, dusty vinyl seat. I stood there, panting, staring at the empty space. I tried to explain it to him, tried to tell him that I saw a girl in a bright jacket with long hair, but my voice was shaking. He just looked exhausted and annoyed, swearing up and down that he would never cheat on me, let alone hide a girl in a suffocatingly hot, locked truck cabin in the middle of the night. He convinced me I was just having a paranoid nightmare, and eventually, I let him guide me back to bed, but my stomach was tied in agonizing knots. I knew what I saw. About an hour later, I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling, when my husband started sleep-talking. Now, he never talks in his sleep, but suddenly he started muttering, his voice distressed. He said, and I am not exaggerating, he mumbled something like, "Why are you following me? Look, I already have a wife. Just leave me alone. You don't need to do this." I snapped. I rolled over and slapped him across the face so hard the sound echoed in the room. He jolted awake, clutching his cheek, completely dazed and asking what he did wrong. I demanded to know who he was telling to leave him alone. He looked terrified, realizing what he had just mumbled. He stammered, rubbing his face, and begged me to just let him sleep, promising he would explain everything in the morning. He swore it wasn't what I thought, but when I woke up the next morning, he was already gone. He had a haul down to Camo province and had left before the sun even came up. I was so livid I called in sick to work. I spent the entire day pacing the house, calling him endlessly, but he wouldn't pick up, texting me that he was driving and couldn't look at his phone. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, the sun was setting, casting this sickly, dim green light over the neighborhood. The air was incredibly still, not a single breeze. I was sitting in the living room, glaring at the muted TV, waiting for him to get home, so we could have it out, and that's when the curtain covering the window next to the TV suddenly whipped violently up into the air. It wasn't a draft. It looked exactly like someone had grabbed the fabric in their fist and yanked it upwards. It hung there for a second, then dropped. I stared at it, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. 30 seconds later, it happened again. Snap! The curtain flew up, exposing the window. Through the glass, in the dim twilight, I swear to God I saw the silhouette of a person standing right outside my window. Just a dark shape with long hair, perfectly still. I bolted up, ran to the window, and ripped the curtain all the way back. Nothing. Just the empty alleyway. Before I could even process that, a horrific noise erupted from our bedroom. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy, wet towel and violently whipping it against the mattress. Whack, 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 thud. I crept toward the bedroom door and flicked the light on. The entire room had been trashed. Our heavy blanket was balled up on the floor. Our pillows were thrown against the far wall. The fitted sheet had been physically peeled off the heavy mattress. The doors to our cheap plastic wardrobe were flung wide open, and the standing fan we used to keep cool had been violently shoved over, crashing onto the tiles. I stood there, completely paralyzed. Our house had no back door. There was only the front door, which I had locked, and I had been sitting in the living room the entire time. No one could have gotten past me. While I was standing there trying to convince myself that maybe a stray cat had somehow gotten in, a deafening crash came from the kitchen behind me. I heard the distinct, sickening sound of plastic Tupperware being aggressively rummaged through, followed by the sharp crack of a ceramic bowl hitting the tile floor and shattering into 100 pieces. I sprinted down the short hallway to the kitchen. There was no one there, just the shattered remains of my rice bowl scattered across the floor and the dish rack rocking back and forth on the counter as if unseen hands had just been digging through it. I grabbed a broom, completely operating on autopilot, my brain utterly failing to compute the impossibility of the situation. I swept up the shards, my hands shaking so violently I kept dropping the dustpan. I walked toward the front of the house to throw the glass in the trash bin by the door, and that's when my blood ran entirely cold. The heavy metal front door, which I had deadbolted an hour ago, was standing wide open. The two front windows were also pushed completely open. I didn't try to be brave. I dropped the broom, grabbed my phone, and called my husband, screaming at him to get home right that second because someone or something was in our house. He promised he was only 2 miles away and would be there immediately. I slammed all the doors shut, locked them, turned the TV volume up to max just to have human voices in the room, and lit a bundle of incense on our small altar, praying to whatever was listening to protect me. My husband burst through the door 10 minutes later, breathless. I was a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. I told him everything: the curtains, the bedroom, the shattering bowl. But because he was a deeply pragmatic, stubborn guy who never believed in the paranormal, he just held me and rationalized it all away. He blamed the wind for the doors, a rat for the dishes, and told me I was just exhausted and stressed from our fight. He even took me out to get some late-night food and bought me a new shirt just to shut me up and calm me down, dodging my questions about his sleep-talking from the night before. I desperately wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel safe in my own home, so I let myself be comforted, and we eventually went to sleep. I should have pressed him for the truth. If he had just told me what happened then, maybe the nightmare wouldn't have escalated. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with that heavy, suffocating feeling you get when you know you aren't alone in a room. You know that instinct? The primitive alarm bell in your brain that tells you eyes are on you. I blinked in the darkness, turning my head slightly on the pillow. My husband was sitting up in bed, right beside me, but he wasn't sitting like he normally did. He was sitting with his legs daintily crossed, tucked underneath him to the side, a posture that his stiff, muscular legs physically couldn't naturally maintain. He was staring down at me in the dark. I mumbled his name, asking him what he was doing. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and began to stroke his hair. But he didn't have hair to stroke. He had a harsh military buzz cut, yet his hand was moving in these long, graceful, flowing motions, starting from the crown of his head and pulling all the way down past his shoulder, mimicking the exact motion of a woman brushing out long, heavy hair. "Babe, stop playing around. You're freaking me out," I whispered, reaching out to push his shoulder so he'd lie back down. The second my fingers grazed his skin, he violently swatted my hand away. The slap echoed in the quiet room, and then he spoke. But it wasn't his voice. The vocal cords belonged to him, but the cadence, the pitch, the unnatural inflection, he was forcing his deep, gravelly voice to sound breathy and feminine. "Who is your husband?" he hissed. Before my brain could even register the absolute horror of that sentence, he lunged at me. He pinned me to the mattress and started choking me, but his movements were all wrong. He wasn't punching me like a man in a bar fight. He was slapping me, vicious, open-handed, frantic strikes across my face and chest, scratching at my skin exactly like two women fighting in the street. Getting hit like that it completely messed up my head. It was like my brain just short-circuited and dragged me right back to the trauma with my ex. I stopped seeing my current husband, and in the pitch black, I thought my abusive ex had finally found me. I stopped fighting back. I just curled up into a fetal position, sobbing, begging, "Please stop, I'm sorry, please don't hit me anymore." The beating went on for what felt like an eternity. And then, completely out of nowhere, he froze. The suffocating weight lifted off my chest. I kept my arms over my face, terrified to move. When I finally peeked through my fingers, my husband was slumped against the headboard, gasping for air like he had been held underwater. He looked down at his hands, then looked at my bleeding lip and scratched face. He burst into tears. My stoic, silent husband, who never showed emotion, just started sobbing hysterically, scrambling to grab a bottle of medicated oil to rub on my bruises and wipe the blood off my face. He kept apologizing, saying he had no idea what just happened, that he couldn't control his own body. I recoiled from him, screaming at him to get away from me, calling him a psycho. He dropped to his knees right there on the bedroom floor, pressing his forehead against the cheap tiles. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I'm being followed. A ghost followed me home." I just stared at him, my lip bleeding, the room spinning. He sat there on the floor and finally confessed the truth. The day he came home late and washed the inside of his truck. He had been driving back through Long in Provence. A young girl, maybe early 20s, driving a scooter without a helmet, had blindly swerved out of an alleyway, but she didn't hit him. She smashed face first into the truck, driving right in front of him. He said she was thrown onto the pavement, just totally mangled and coughing up blood while the other driver was in shock. So, being the guy he is, he didn't wait for an ambulance. He jumped out, picked her up, put her in the passenger seat of his truck, and sped toward the nearest hospital, running red lights with his hazards on. But she didn't make it. She died right there in the passenger seat, bleeding out onto the vinyl, about 10 minutes before they reached the emergency room. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to traumatize me. He just washed the blood out and tried to forget it. But because she died in his vehicle, her spirit latched onto the truck. And because he drove the truck directly to our house and parked it out front, she followed him right to our doorstep. He admitted that he had been having terrifying dreams all week, dreams where he was driving, and she would suddenly appear in the passenger seat, telling him that since he tried to save her life, she wanted to repay him by becoming his wife. In the dreams, he kept telling her he was already married, and that's exactly what I had heard him sleep talking about. She didn't accept his rejection. She destroyed his tire, smashed his blinker, and finally, out of sheer jealousy, she entered our home to eliminate the woman she saw as her rival, me. The next morning, we didn't even go to work. We drove straight to a highly respected monk at a temple in the city. The monk listened to our story and shook his head, explaining that because the girl died a violent, sudden death on the road, he couldn't just perform a simple banishment. Her spirit was incredibly volatile. He told us we had to go back to the exact location of the accident to appease her. My husband loaded a small statue of the Buddha into his truck cab. He actually told me something that made a weird kind of sense. He said, "Hey, if she's sitting in the truck with us right now, that's actually a good thing. We can just drive her back. The only thing we should be terrified of is if she stayed behind in the house." And with that, I white-knuckled the door handle the entire drive down to Long An. When we arrived at the intersection where she was hit, my jaw dropped. There was a family setting up a small offering table on the side of the road. We approached them, and it turned out to be the girl's mother and younger sister. It was exactly 2 weeks since the accident, the second spiritual week of her passing. We told her family everything. The mother just wept, begging her daughter's spirit to come home. We went with them back to their house, which was terrifyingly only 500 meters away from the crash site. We offered incense at her altar, prayed at her grave behind the house, offered food at the side of the road where she fell, and finally, stopped at the hospital where she was pronounced dead. At every single stop, my husband bowed his head and pleaded with her. He told her he was deeply sorry for her tragic fate, that he only wanted to help her in her final moments, but that he had a family to protect and she could not follow him anymore. It's been years now. We actually have a kid of our own, and things are back to normal. Well, as normal as they can be after your husband gets possessed by a dead girl. We finished all the rituals at the 4 locations like the monk said, and it worked. We even went to her first anniversary feast a year after it happened, just to be respectful, though we haven't been back since. It's crazy, right? My husband still drives that same truck, but now he has a small Buddha statue on the dash. He told me that about 3 or 4 years after the accident, he was driving past that exact same spot, and he saw that the locals had actually built a small granite shrine right there on the side of the road where he picked her up. There was incense burning and everything. I guess she was really active around there, you know. So yeah, he always honks his horn 3 times when he passes it now. He says it's for her and for us, to make sure everyone gets home safe this time. Okay, so this happened back when I was a personal driver for a corporate guy in District 1. I used to cycle miles from Funduan just to get to work, and honestly, the boss felt bad for me. He started letting me bring his car home, which was a huge deal for me back then. Anyway, we had this early morning trip scheduled for Long An. The client meeting was at 7 a.m., meaning I had to be rolling out by 4. I explicitly told my wife, "Hey, get me up at 3:30. But you know how it is. She gets nervous about me being late, so she ended up waking my ass up an entire hour early, at 2:30 a.m. I had no idea I was an hour early. I remember stumbling out of bed, the concrete floor freezing against my bare feet, and my brain was just absolute mush. I didn't bother checking the wall clock because, honestly, when you're the sole provider for your family and your job depends on driving a wealthy executive around in a pristine Camry, which, by the way, was worth an absolute fortune back then, easily tens of thousands of bucks, something a guy like me couldn't afford in 3 lifetimes. You don't question the alarm. You just move. I stood in the cramped, dimly lit bathroom of our tiny house, splashing freezing tap water onto my face, aggressively scrubbing my teeth with this cheap, chalky toothpaste, just trying to force my eyes to stay open. The whole house was dead quiet, save for the hum of our old ceiling fan. I threw on my uniform, grabbed the car keys, and slipped out the front door, shivering a bit as the heavy, humid night air of Saigon hit me. I fired up the engine, the low purr of it echoing a little too loudly in the narrow alleyway, and slowly navigated my way out onto the main roads. Now, usually, Saigon is a city that refuses to sleep. Even at 3 or 4 in the morning, you'd expect to see life. The route from Funwan towards District 1 is a long, straight shot down Hai Ba Trung Street, and it's normally peppered with early risers. You'd usually see these older women setting up their little carts, the smell of steaming, sticky rice cutting through the exhaust fumes, or you'd see the newspaper vendors, especially the newspaper folks, sitting cross-legged under the street lamps, spreading their stacks of damp paper out on the pavement to sort them before the morning rush. But this night, it was a complete void. I remember driving block after block, the yellow glow of the streetlights washing over the hood of the car, and just feeling this creeping sense of isolation. There wasn't a single cart, not a single vendor, just me, gripping the cold steering wheel, staring out at empty sidewalks. I kept my foot light on the gas, strictly obeying every single traffic law, because my boss would absolutely skin me alive if I got a ticket in his luxury vehicle. I hit one red light, waited it out in the dead silence. Hit another one, waited it out. My brain was just doing that numb, rambling thing it does when you're sleep deprived, complaining internally about how unfair it was that I was awake while the rest of the city was comfortably buried under their blankets. And then, I reached the intersection of Hai Ba Trung and Vo Ti Sao. If you know the area, you know that right at that corner sits Levantam Park. It's a massive, sprawling green space now, but back in the day, before 75, it was the Mac Din Chi Cemetery, a massive burial ground strictly reserved for high-ranking politicians and the ultra-wealthy. They eventually relocated the graves to build the park, but anyone who grew up around there knows the soil is heavy with history. Anyway, as I rolled up to the red light at that specific intersection, I realized something was wrong with the lighting. The street lamps lining the park side were completely dead. It wasn't like they flickered and went out as I approached. They were just pitch black, swallowing the entire corner in this thick, unnatural darkness. The only illumination was the harsh red glare of the traffic light reflecting off the asphalt in front of me. I was just sitting there, the engine idling, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel, trying to peer into the dark tree line of the park, wondering if maybe a transformer blew or if the city just cut the power early. The silence inside the cabin was absolute until I heard this deliberate, hollow tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. Almost like a knuckle rapping directly against the passenger side window, and I swear my heart did a miserable little flip in my chest. I slowly turned my head, squinting through the glass, and there, standing just inches from my car door, was a man. My immediate reaction was just annoyance mixed with a spike of anxiety. I automatically assessed him as a vagrant or maybe a drunk who had wandered out of an alley. He was wearing this really grimy, faded bucket hat pulled low over his forehead, the brim short and frayed. His clothes hung off him like rags, oversized and stained with something dark. And even through the sealed glass, my brain almost tricked me into smelling stale alcohol and unwashed skin. But it was his eyes that locked me in place. They were this raw, infected red, not glowing or anything cinematic like that, but deeply bloodshot, the bags underneath them sagging heavily, like the flesh was melting off his cheekbones. He looked like a man who had been on a 10-day drinking bender and had just crawled out of a gutter. He raised his hand and tapped the glass again. I didn't want to engage, but I was sitting at a red light in a very expensive car, and the last thing I needed was some crazy guy scratching the paint. So I reached over and cranked the manual window handle, just rolling it down maybe an inch, barely enough to let the damp air in. Before he could even speak, I immediately put up a defensive wall, telling him in this annoyed tone that I was just a broke driver, that this wasn't my car, and that I didn't have a single dime to give him, so he shouldn't even bother asking for money. He didn't even react to my rejection. He just tilted his head, his voice raspy and bizarrely flat, and asked, "Hey brother, what time is it right now, so I know the way back to my house?" It was such a specific, weirdly structured question. My brain snagged on it. Why would knowing the time help him find his house? I started to get genuinely irritated, muttering to myself about how homeless guys shouldn't be worrying about schedules, but out of pure habit, I lifted my left wrist to check my watch. Nothing. Bare skin. A wave of frustration washed over me. I realized I must have taken it off the night before and left it on my bedside table because I was so exhausted. And back then, cars like that didn't have digital dashboard clocks, so I was completely clueless. I let out a heavy sigh, turning my head back to the crack in the window to tell the guy I had forgotten my watch and couldn't help him. But when I looked out, there was no one there. The sidewalk was completely empty. The space right next to the door, where he had been standing less than 2 seconds ago, was vacant. The red light was still glaring down on the asphalt. I snapped my head left, then right, looking in the rearview mirrors, trying to spot a silhouette walking away. Nothing. It was a wide-open intersection. Unless he had literally sprinted full speed into the pitch-black tree line of the park, there was no physical way he could have vanished that fast. My stomach gave this nasty, uncomfortable lurch, but you know how the human mind works. It absolutely refuses to accept the impossible. Internal gaslighting kicked in immediately. I convinced myself that he had just ducked down quickly, or maybe he slipped behind the trunk of the car where I couldn't see him, realized I wasn't going to give him anything, and walked off into the shadows. The light finally turned green, and I practically slammed my foot on the gas, eager to put distance between me and that creepy corner. I drove past the length of the park, approaching the very next intersection, Hai Ba Trung and Dien Bien Phu. It's a super short distance, maybe a couple of 100 yards max. The park still bordered my left side, and the darkness was still heavy. The light up ahead turned red again. I cursed under my breath, easing on the brakes, stopping the car. I was still annoyed about forgetting my watch, worrying if I was going to be late to pick up the boss, calculating the drive time in my head. I was sitting there for maybe 15 seconds, in complete silence, before I heard that exact same tapping sound. Tap, 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 echoing right next to my ear, making my blood turn to ice water as I slowly turned my head to the passenger window. It was him, the exact same guy. The filthy bucket hat, the oversized rags, the sagging, bloodshot eyes. My brain completely short-circuited. There was absolutely no way he could have beaten my car to this intersection. Even if he had sprinted at Olympic speeds, I would have seen him running down the sidewalk. Yet here he was, standing completely still, not breathing hard, not sweating, just staring at me with that dead, hollow expression. The panic started to bubble up in my throat, but it morphed instantly into this aggressive, defensive anger. A survival mechanism, I guess. I rolled the window down that same tiny crack and just snapped at him, calling him a crazy bastard, demanding to know why the hell he was following me from the last block, and what his actual problem was. I asked him where he even lived, that he needed to know the time so badly. He didn't blink. He just slowly raised a filthy, dirt-caked finger and pointed straight past my car, across my face, directly into the pitch-black void of Levantam Park. "My house is right in there," he whispered, his voice slicing right through the hum of my engine. "Just Tell me the time, so I know the way to go home. My breath hitched. The park. The former cemetery. He was pointing into a graveyard and calling it his house. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to roll up the window and run the red light, but I was paralyzed. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, and lied to him again, telling him I didn't have my freaking watch, that I left it at home, and to just leave me alone. He slowly lowered his hand, staring right through me, and said, "No, you didn't. Your watch is sitting right inside that glove box." Every single muscle in my body locked up. I just stared at him. How did he know? He hadn't been inside the car. He hadn't even looked down. And then, like a physical blow to the chest, the memory hit me. Yesterday afternoon, it had poured down rain while I was waiting for my boss. My watch wasn't waterproof, and it was a cheap metal thing I cherished, so before I got out to open the door with the umbrella, I had unclasped it and shoved it deep into the passenger side glove compartment. I had completely forgotten about it. My hands were shaking violently as I leaned over, keeping my eyes glued to the crack in the window, and popped the glove box open. I reached blindly inside, my fingers brushing against old registration papers and napkins, until they closed around the cold metal band of my watch. I pulled it out, bringing it up to the dim dashboard light. It read exactly 3:15 a.m. I let out a shaky breath, turning back to the window to tell him. But he was gone. Again, just vanished into thin air. The light turned green, and this time, I didn't care about traffic laws. I hit the accelerator hard, my tires actually squealing a bit on the pavement, fleeing from that cursed park. I was trembling, checking my mirrors obsessively, terrified I'd see that bucket hat sitting in the back seat. I tried to calm myself down, staring at the watch on my wrist. 3:15 a.m. That meant my wife had woken me up at 2:30. I was absurdly early. I still had miles to go before I reached the boss's house near Notre Dame Cathedral, but the panic was deeply rooted now. I approached the next major intersection, Nguyen Tum Kai. The streetlights were actually working here, casting a slightly more comforting glow. I stopped at the red light, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Then, someone shouted from the sidewalk, "Hey! Hey, buddy!" I nearly jumped out of my skin, jerking my head toward the sound. It was an old man, a newspaper vendor standing under a streetlight, organizing his stacks. He was pointing frantically at the back of my car. I cracked the window, my voice shaking, telling him I didn't want to buy any papers. He shook his head, looking at me like I was an idiot, and yelled over the engine noise that my rear passenger tire was completely flat, that I was going to ruin the expensive rims if I kept driving on it, and that I needed to pull over immediately. I felt this deep sinking dread in my gut. A flat tire. Now. Of all times. I slowly pulled the car over to the curb, right beneath the shadow of some overhanging trees, and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. I stepped out, the humid air wrapping around me, and walked to the back. Sure enough, the tire was completely blown out, the rubber folded over the rim. I didn't have time to be scared anymore. I had a job to do. I popped the trunk, dragging out the heavy spare tire, the jack, and the lug wrench. I was sweating profusely, my hands slipping on the cold metal. I got the car jacked up, fitting the wrench over the first lug nut. I put my weight into it, and it groaned. But it turned. One off, then the second, the third, the fourth. They were tough, but manageable. Then I got to the fifth lug nut. It wouldn't budge. I strained against the wrench, my arms burning, but it felt like it was welded to the rim. I was breathing heavily, my vision blurring slightly from the exertion and the panic. I literally stood up, placing my foot on the handle of the wrench, using my entire body weight to bounce on it, trying to force it to crack open. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was rusted tight, or cross-threaded. I didn't know. I was standing there in the dim light, wiping grease and sweat from my forehead, feeling utterly defeated. And then, a voice floated across the empty street. "Hey, brother!" I froze. The wrench slipped from my hands, clattering onto the asphalt. I slowly looked up, peering across the wide expanse of the intersection. Standing on the opposite corner, half hidden in the shadows of a closed pharmacy, was the man in the bucket hat. His oversized clothes hung limply. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of those bleeding red eyes boring into me. "I asked you a few times already." His voice carried unnaturally well, echoing as if he were whispering directly into my ear. "Just tell me what time it is, and I'll come over there and help you fix your car." The primal terror that washed over me is something I can't even put into words. The boundary of reality just shattered. He had followed me. He was playing with me. My mind desperately tried to reject the situation. I focused intensely on the ground, my eyes locking onto a discarded, crushed cigarette butt near my shoe. I stared at the faded red logo on the paper, hyper-fixating on how dirty it was, trying to anchor myself to something, anything real, while this nightmare unfolded across the street. The fear twisted into this hysterical, blind rage. I looked up, my voice cracking, and just screamed across the empty street at him. I told him he was a homeless piece of garbage, asking how the hell he thought he could fix a luxury car, telling him to leave me the fuck alone. But I was so broken, so desperate to just make him go away, that I threw my arms up and yelled it, "It's 3:20 a.m. It's 3:20 in the morning. There. Are you happy?" The silence that followed was suffocating. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there for a long, agonizing second. And then, the corners of his mouth twitched upwards into a slow, unnatural smile. "I fixed it for you," he whispered, his voice echoing from everywhere at once. "Thanks." I blinked, and the corner was empty. He was just gone. I stood there, my chest heaving, staring at the empty sidewalk. My brain couldn't process what had just happened. Fixed it? What did he mean? Slowly, mechanically, I lowered my gaze back to the flat tire. My heart completely stopped. The lug wrench was lying on the ground where I had dropped it, but right next to it, resting perfectly upright on the asphalt in a neat little row, were 5 lug nuts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stared at the rim of the wheel. The 5th nut, the one that had held my entire body weight without budging a millimeter, was gone. The threaded stud was completely bare, the metal perfectly clean, as if unseen. Impossibly strong fingers had just reached down and effortlessly unscrewed it while I was distracted. A wave of absolute nausea hit me. The body horror of realizing a physical, unseen force had manipulated the metal right at my feet was too much. I fell to my knees, scraping them against the road, and just started frantically pressing my palms together, bowing my head over and over to the empty street. I was babbling, practically crying, begging whatever spirit or demon was out there to forgive me. I apologized for cursing, for being arrogant, pleading that I was just a stupid driver who didn't know any better, begging it to take the time and leave me alone. I don't even remember the physical act of changing the rest of the tire. It was pure instinct, driven by raw adrenaline. I threw the flat into the trunk, tightened the nuts on the spare with trembling, frantic hands, dropped the jack, and scrambled into the driver's seat. I slammed the locks down, threw it in gear, and sped off. I blew through the next 2 red lights, constantly checking the mirrors, terrified that bucket hat would appear in my peripheral vision. I made it to the boss's house at exactly 3:55 a.m. When he finally came downstairs, sharp in his suit, he immediately noticed how pale and sweaty I was. I practically begged him to cancel the trip. I told him everything. The ghost, the asking for time, the impossible lug nut. I told him my grandmother always warned that seeing a ghost before a long journey was a death omen. He just scoffed at me. He told me I was losing my mind, that a multi-million-dollar contract didn't wait for peasant superstitions, and that if I didn't drive him right then, I was fired on the spot. I had no choice. I put the car in drive, my hands shaking violently on the wheel, and headed toward the highway. After all that, I was just a nervous wreck driving down the highway. And I swear, right as we crossed the Bindien Bridge, this massive fish truck just rear-ended us. Bam! The whole trunk was caved in like a V-shape. The car was completely dead. Wouldn't even start. My boss in his expensive suit literally had to stand on the side of the road and flagged down a sketchy public bus to make his meeting. I had to wait for a tow truck. When I finally got home, my wife made me bathe in pomelo leaves and burn some herbs to clear the bad energy. Surprisingly, the boss didn't even dock my pay. He actually believed the ghost brought the bad luck. But man, I never drove down Hai Ba Trung at night ever again. I spent my college years in Hue, and I had this whole system figured out for going back to my hometown in Quang Tri. Always travel during the day. That was my strict rule. You leave around noon. You get there by 4 or 5 p.m. No stress at all. But life happens, right? It was a few months post-TET, and my workload was just insane. I got stuck on campus and missed my usual afternoon ride. Ended up having to buy a ticket for the 7 p.m. bus. By the time we crossed over into Quang Tri, it was dead night, maybe pushing 9 p.m. And I wasn't even home yet. I still had to stand out there and wait for a second, smaller local bus to drag me back into my district. And when I say waiting, I don't mean sitting on a nice bench inside some brightly lit terminal building with security guards and vending machines. No. The drop-off for the main intercity buses was just this chaotic intersection, and to catch my local transit line, I had to walk about, maybe 300 meters down Highway 1A, just trudging along the dirt shoulder of the main national highway in the pitch black. Highway 1A at night is an entirely different beast than it is during the day. During the day, it's just dusty and loud, but at night, it's this massive, roaring artery of heavy machinery. You've got these massive 18-wheelers and shipping container trucks just barreling down the asphalt at terrifying speeds. Every time one passes, the draft literally tries to suck you into the road, and the ground vibrates so hard you can feel it in your teeth. So, I'm dragging my duffel bag down the dirt shoulder, completely exhausted, just drained from the week of classes. My clothes are sticking to my back from the humidity, and all I want to do is collapse into my own bed. I finally get to the designated bus stop, and calling it a stop is being incredibly generous. There was no shelter, no bench. It was literally just a rusty metal pole jammed into the dirt with a faded chipped sign on top, indicating it was a transit pickup point. The only illumination was this single, sickly orange sodium street lamp hanging from a concrete pillar a little ways down, casting these long, distorted shadows across the gravel. I dropped my bag at the base of the pole, let out this huge sigh, and just kind of slumped my shoulders, settling in for the wait. I figured, okay, it's past 8:30. These local buses usually run every 15 minutes or so. I shouldn't be out here long. I was looking down at my phone, trying to see if I had any signal, when I realized I wasn't alone. I glanced over to my right, and maybe, I'd say about 10 or 12 feet away from me, just at the edge of the orange light pool, there was a guy. He was just a young guy, maybe around my age, looking like any standard guy heading back to his hometown. He had on this dark baseball cap, pulled down pretty low, a faded striped button-down shirt that looked a little too big for him, some dusty jeans, and a pair of cheap rubber sandals. He had a bulky canvas backpack resting in the dirt right next to him. But the thing was, he wasn't standing. He was squatting in that very typical, flat-footed crouch, his knees splayed out wide, and he was eating. He had this whole loaf of banh mi, just the plain, crusty baguette, and he was tearing into it. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people get hungry, whatever. I just kind of gave him that standard, tight-lipped nod you give strangers at night to acknowledge their existence without inviting a conversation. But he didn't look up. He just kept staring straight ahead at the asphalt, completely locked in on tearing bites out of this bread. I looked away, staring down the long, empty stretch of the highway, waiting for the familiar headlights of my bus. But the longer we waited there in the humid night, the more the sound of his eating started to get to me. You have to understand the acoustic environment out there. Every few minutes, a massive truck would roar past, drowning out the whole world in this deafening rumble of diesel engines and rattling metal. But in the quiet pockets between the trucks, all I could hear was him. He wasn't chewing normally. He was eating with this desperate, animalistic intensity. I could hear the dry, raspy tearing of the bread crust, followed by this really wet, heavy smacking sound as he chewed with his mouth open. It was this rhythmic tear, crunch, smack, 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 just echoing in the humid air. I remember shifting my weight, feeling this weird prickle of annoyance, and, I don't know, a tiny bit of unease at the base of my neck. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the guy was probably just exhausted from a long shift at some factory, starving, just trying to get some carbs in his system before he got home. I actively avoided looking at him again because I didn't want to be the weirdo staring at a guy eating his dinner in the dirt. About 10 minutes go by. Finally, way down the highway, I see them. The distinctive, wide-set headlights of the local transit bus cutting through the dark. My mood instantly lifted. Oh, finally, I thought. I grabbed the handle of my duffel bag, stepped right up to the edge of the asphalt, and raised my arm high. I started doing the standard wave, flagging them down clearly. The bus was moving pretty fast, kicking up dust, but as it got closer, I could clearly see the route number glowing in the windshield. It was my bus. I took a half step forward, keeping my arm raised, making absolute sure the driver saw me. The bus closed the distance. 50 yards, 30 yards, 10 yards. It didn't slow down. It didn't put its turn signal on. It didn't veer toward the shoulder. It just blew right past me. The wall of hot, exhaust-smelling air smacked me in the face, making me stumble back a step. But here's the weird part. As the cab of the bus passed me, literally as the driver's window was parallel to me, I heard the sharp hiss of the air brakes. The driver tapped the brakes hard, causing the heavy chassis of the bus to lurch down for a split second, the tires screeching slightly on the pavement. It was the exact reaction of a driver who just got startled, like he hadn't seen me standing there until he was right on top of me. But instead of pulling over a few yards down, the engine revved back up, the brake lights clicked off, and the bus just kept hauling down the highway, leaving me standing there in a cloud of swirling dust. I dropped my arm, completely bewildered. I muttered some choice words under my breath, just pure frustration. I looked down at my shirt. It was a lighter color, not exactly camouflage. I was standing directly under the street lamp. I was right next to the official transit pole. How in the hell did he not see me until the last possible second? I glanced over at the guy eating the bread. He hadn't flinched. The bus had just blasted past us, kicking up gravel, and he was still just squatting there, staring at the road, rhythmically chewing his banh mi. Whatever. It's fine. Maybe the driver was off his shift, or maybe he was running late and didn't want to stop for one passenger. I checked my phone. 8:47 p.m. The next one would be along soon. I stood there for another 10, maybe 15 minutes. The quiet between the semi-trucks was starting to feel really heavy. The wet chewing sounds from my right were starting to actually make my stomach turn a little bit. Just this grating, repetitive noise that I couldn't block out. Then, headlights again. Another transit bus, same route number. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. I picked up my bag, stepped practically onto the white line of the highway, and waved my arm aggressively. I was practically doing jumping jacks out there. The bus approached. It was going fast again. I held my ground, waving, making aggressive eye contact with the giant windshield. Once again, it didn't slow down. It kept its trajectory right down the middle of the lane. As it got within a few yards, the driver slammed on the brakes again. Hiss! The bus violently dipped, the tires barking against the asphalt. They had definitely seen me, but way too late. They were already overshooting the stop. But this time, the folding doors in the middle of the bus were propped open to let the air in, and the assistant, the fare collector guy, was hanging onto the handrail, leaning out. As the bus carried its momentum past me, the assistant glared down at me, his face twisted in annoyance, and he just screamed over the engine noise, "Stand somewhere else. Who the hell is gonna see you standing right there to pick you up? And before I could even process what he said, the driver hit the gas and the bus roared off into the night. I just stood there, my arms still half raised, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Are you kidding me? I was absolutely livid. I yelled out into the empty highway, asking the universe what the hell his problem was. I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. I was right at the designated pole. I wasn't hiding in the bushes. The unfairness of it just spiked my blood pressure. I was so incredibly tired, so desperate to get home, and these drivers were treating me like I was doing something wrong. I looked down at my wallet. I had exactly 35,000 dong left in there, barely $2. That wasn't even enough to negotiate a ride with a sketchy motorcycle taxi at this hour, even if one happened to drive by. If I didn't catch a bus, I was going to be walking for hours in the dark. I was on the verge of tears, not from sadness, but from that pure, helpless frustration you get when you're exhausted and broke. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and prepared for the next one. It took almost 20 minutes this time. The night was getting colder, the dampness seeping into my clothes. The guy to my right was still there, still chewing. I was so hyper-focused on my own misery I completely tuned him out. Bus number 3 appeared on the horizon. I told myself, I am getting on this freaking bus if I have to throw my body onto the hood. As it got closer, I stepped entirely off the dirt shoulder and planted my feet right in the right-hand lane of the highway. I started waving my arms wildly, like a guy trying to flag down a rescue helicopter on a desert island. I was not going to let him pass. The driver saw me. He actually flashed his brights and started to decelerate, veering the heavy vehicle toward the shoulder to pull in. Relief washed over me. Finally. But right at that exact second, this massive multi-ton shipping container truck came, hurtling up from behind the bus in the passing lane. The truck driver must have been impatient or sleepy, because he swerved into the right lane way too early, violently cutting the bus off. The bus driver had to jerk the steering wheel to the left to avoid getting clipped by the truck's massive rear trailer. The horn blasted, this deafening, terrifying blast of air that shook my ribs. Because of the evasive maneuver, the bus completely lost its angle to pull over. The driver had no choice but to gun the engine and merge back into traffic behind the truck to avoid an accident. I watched the red taillights of the third bus shrink into the darkness. It was gone. I stumbled back onto the dirt shoulder, my knees literally shaking from the adrenaline of the near miss with the truck and the crushing weight of reality. I dropped my bag into the dirt and just let out this pathetic, broken sound. I felt completely defeated. I was stranded. It was past 9:30 p.m. The buses might stop running soon. I was going to have to sleep in the dirt on the side of Highway 1A. I was standing there, staring at the ground, trying to figure out if I could somehow walk to the main terminal and beg someone for a ride, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I spun around. Walking toward me from the direction of the main station compound was this older woman. She was wearing the standard-issue blue uniform of the transit workers, probably a janitor or a ticketing clerk finishing her late shift. But the weird thing was, she wasn't carrying a flashlight or a bag. She was holding 3 lit incense sticks between her palms. The glowing red cherries at the tips cut through the gloom, and a thick ribbon of pungent sandalwood smoke trailed over her shoulder. She walked up to me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Son," she asked, her voice raspy, "what are you doing standing out here so late?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I told her I was just trying to catch the local transit line back to my district. I explained how 3 separate buses had just blown right past me, how the last one almost got hit by a truck, and how the assistant on the second bus actually yelled at me for where I was standing. The transit lady stopped walking. The expression on her face shifted from confusion to this profound, heavy exasperation. She shook her head, looking at me like I was a toddler playing on a train track. For crying out loud, she sighed, waving her hand at the space next to me. "Why in the world are you standing right next to the shrine? Of course they can't see you. You need to back up at least 30 meters down the road if you want anyone to pick you up." I froze. My brain completely stalled out. I slowly turned my head to the right, pointing my finger toward the spot 10 feet away. I opened my mouth to tell her that I wasn't standing next to a shrine. I was standing next to the guy in the striped shirt. The guy who had been sitting there, aggressively chewing a loaf of banh mi for the last 45 minutes. But when I looked at the spot under the orange street lamp, the guy was gone. There was no backpack, no dusty sandals, no guy squatting in the dirt. Right in the exact physical space where he had been sitting, occupying the exact same volume of air, was a concrete spirit shrine. It was small, maybe waist high, painted a faded yellow, resting on a concrete pedestal. It looked relatively new, but covered in a layer of highway dust. My stomach plummeted. The blood rushed out of my face so fast I felt dizzy. A wave of pure ice-cold electricity shot down my spine, paralyzing my legs. I had walked this route a dozen times during the day over the past 2 years. I knew every pothole, every signpost. There had never been a shrine here. Never. I stood there, hyperventilating slightly, unable to take my eyes off the concrete structure. The older woman didn't seem to notice my absolute mental breakdown. She just walked right past me, stepping up to the little shrine. She bowed her head a few times, planted the 3 smoking incense sticks into a little sand-filled urn at the front, and then she reached into the deep pocket of her blue uniform jacket. She pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside it was a completely fresh, unbitten loaf of crusty banh mi. She carefully unwrapped it and placed the bread right onto the center of the shrine's altar, right next to the burning incense. My mind was screaming, "Holy fucking shit." My hands started shaking violently. The sound of that wet, heavy chewing, smack, 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 suddenly echoed in my memory so loudly I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I realized, with a sickening jolt of absolute horror, why the guy hadn't acknowledged me, why he hadn't reacted to the buses, why he was just staring at the asphalt. The transit lady stepped back, brushing the dust off her hands. "I keep telling the bosses they need to move this transit pole." She grumbled, almost talking to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. "It's dangerous. You stand right here, you get completely hidden. It's like a blind spot. The drivers, they're going 50 miles an hour. By the time they break through the haze and actually see a living person standing here, they're only 5 meters away. They have to slam on the brakes, almost cause a pileup, and they just have to keep driving." She turned to look at me, her eyes dead serious. "People around here know," she said quietly. "He covers their eyes." I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the fresh loaf of bread sitting on the concrete. She looked at the bread, then back at me, her expression softening into something resembling pity. "It was right after the New Year," she explained, her voice dropping into a hushed, respectful tone. "The 8th day of Tet. There was a young guy out here, headed up to Hugh for a new factory job, waiting for the bus right where you were standing. He was sitting on his bag, eating his dinner, a plain loaf of bread." She pointed a finger out toward the dark asphalt of the passing lane. "Container truck," she said grimly. "Driver was doing a 30-hour haul. Fell asleep at the wheel. The truck drifted right off the pavement and plowed straight through the shoulder. Didn't even touch the brakes. I felt bile rising in the back of my throat. I couldn't look away from the shrine. Killed him instantly," the older woman continued, her words painting a picture I desperately didn't want to see. "When the paramedics finally got out here, it was awful. They said he didn't even know what hit him. He still had the bread in his hands. He had just taken a bite. The medics said when they tried to move him, his mouth was just pouring out blood, thick with all the chewed up pieces of bread he hadn't even swallowed yet." My vision swam. The wet, rhythmic smacking sound I had been listening to for 45 minutes wasn't just someone eating. It was the sound of a hungry ghost, trapped in a violent loop, desperately trying to finish his last meal, in the exact spot his life was violently ripped away. "He died hungry," the transit lady whispered, looking at the glowing incense. "A sudden, hungry death. So the locals built this shrine to appease him. Anyone who knows the story brings a fresh loaf of bread when they pass by, hoping he'll bless them with safe travels. But if you stand right next to him while you wait, he doesn't like sharing the space. He hides you from the road." She patted my shoulder, pulling me out of my paralyzing shock. "Back up down the road, son. Right now. The last bus of the night comes in 5 minutes." I didn't say a single word. I grabbed my duffel bag and practically sprinted backward, dragging my feet through the dirt until I was a good 40 meters away from the pole, away from the pool of orange light, away from the shrine. I stood in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes locked onto that little concrete box. I didn't blink. I was terrified that if I took my eyes off it, the guy in the striped shirt would be squatting there again. 5 minutes later, the final local transit bus of the night came over the horizon. I raised my arm. The bus saw me from a mile away. The turn signal blinked on. The air brakes hissed smoothly, and the heavy vehicle pulled gracefully onto the shoulder, stopping right in front of me. The doors hissed open. I scrambled up the steps, paid my fare, and collapsed into a seat in the very back row. As the bus accelerated back onto the highway, I pressed my face against the cold glass of the window, looking back at the transit pole. The orange street lamp cast a sickly glow over the dirt. The pole was empty, but sitting right there on the concrete altar, illuminated by the red cherries of the burning incense, was the fresh loaf of bread. You bet your life I never traveled at night after that. From then on, I timed my trips perfectly, so I'd reach that exact stretch of the highway by 4 or 5 p.m. at the latest. When I went back a few months later, I saw that the transportation guys actually listened to that station worker. The metal bus stop sign had been dug up and bolted back into the ground about 15 meters further away. But the shrine, it didn't move. And every time I looked out the window as we drove by, I always saw a completely untouched, fresh piece of bread sitting on the altar. You know how some people just shouldn't go into business for themselves? Yeah, that's me. I am one of those people. About 7 or 8 years ago, I took basically my entire life savings and decided to build this massive outdoor garden restaurant on a huge vacant plot of land that belonged to my parents out in Thanh Mien, which is this quiet provincial town in Hai Duong. I wasn't some hospitality genius or anything. I just loved drinking beer with my buddies, and I had a decent knack for cooking, so I figured, why the hell not? I poured everything I had into it. I laid down tons of gravel, hauled in these giant bamboo clusters to make it look like a rustic countryside getaway, set up dozens of tables under the fairy lights, the whole 9 yards. And honestly, for the first 3 or 4 months, I really thought I had made it. The place was packed every single night. The smell of grilled meat and the sound of people clinking glasses. It felt like I was printing money. But you know how the honeymoon phase goes. Once the novelty wore off, the reality of my terrible location kicked in. The restaurant was tucked away down this awkward dirt road, not on the main street. So pretty soon, the weekday crowds just completely vanished. I'm talking dead silence from Monday to Friday. We'd get maybe, I don't know, 5 tables the entire week. It was just me and the staff sitting around, staring at the plastic chairs, swatting mosquitoes, watching my bank account drain. Any rational person would have cut their losses, right? They would have laid off staff or run promotions or just shut it down. But I was stubborn and desperate. Since I was only getting decent traffic on Saturdays and Sundays, I came up with this brilliant, completely screwed up idea to take out another loan from my family and buy a used car to run as a rogue taxi during the week. I found this cheap, 4-door hatchback, an old Hyundai with out-of-province plates. The guy selling it swore up and down that it had a clean record, no crashes, no flood damage, nothing. And it looked fine on the outside, so I bought it on the spot. I should have known right then that you get exactly what you pay for. Literally the day I drove it home, the transmission started slipping and the AC completely died, forcing me to dump another 15 million dong, which is roughly $600. A massive hit for me at the time, just to get the damn thing running. And even then, it was a complete money pit. I was driving around all day burning gas, getting maybe 2 or 3 fares if I was lucky, sometimes coming home with absolutely zero cash after a 12-hour shift. But the mechanical issues were nothing compared to the other stuff. It started on a Sunday. The restaurant was actually somewhat busy, and my sister had brought her kids over to support the place. My niece, Haley, who was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, was running around the gravel lot playing hide and seek with the other kids. I had parked the taxi way in the back corner of the property, backed up right against this big bamboo thicket, leaving maybe a 2-foot gap between the rear bumper and the tree trunks. Haley decided that gap was the perfect hiding spot. I was busy in the kitchen, but I heard about all of this later. Apparently, the first time she crouched down behind the trunk, the car suddenly honked. Just a quick sharp beep, and the hazard lights flashed. She got caught immediately. Obviously, she just assumed I had some weird anti-theft sensor on the car, so a few rounds later, she hid there again. This time, she said the engine actually turned over. A thick cloud of exhaust blew right into her face, forcing her to cough and give away her spot. When my sister complained to me about leaving the engine running, I was completely baffled. I reached into my apron and pulled out the only set of keys. They had been in my pocket the entire time. I walked over, unlocked the door, and the dashboard was completely dead. I just muttered some excuse about faulty Korean wiring, because your brain will do anything to rationalize the impossible when you're stressed about money, and I went back to cooking. I don't know why kids are so damn stubborn, but instead of finding a new spot, Haley foolishly snuck right back behind the taxi for a third time. She told me later she was just being super careful not to physically touch the metal bumper so she wouldn't trigger the alarm again. But while she was crouching there, she realized she wasn't alone. She told me later that she peeked through the rear window into the cabin, and she saw a little boy, a bald kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, standing on the driver's seat. And the thing that still makes me sick to my stomach is what she described next. She said this little kid had his hands wrapped around the steering wheel, and he was violently yanking it back and forth. If you know anything about cars, you know that when the engine is off, the power steering is dead. The wheel locks up. It takes the strength of a grown man to force it to turn even an inch. But Haley swore she saw this tiny kid throwing the wheel left and right like it was a toy, and the heavy front tires of the car were actually grinding into the gravel, turning with his hands. She thought it was her little cousin, Toby, just messing around inside. But then the horn blared. The car physically lurched backward on its own without the engine even running, and the bumper bumped right into her shoulder, knocking her into the dirt. She ran screaming to the dining area, yelling that Toby was trapped inside the suffocating, locked car. I sprinted over there, my heart in my throat, terrified that a kid was suffocating in the heat. I yanked the doors open, checking under the seats, in the trunk, everywhere. But it was completely empty, and when I looked back at the tables, Toby was fast asleep in his mother's arms. He had been there the whole time. Haley started sobbing uncontrollably, refusing to ever step foot near my restaurant again. And me, I brushed it off. I told everyone it was just a shadow, a trick of the fairy lights. I was so deep in my own financial hole that I couldn't afford to believe my car was haunted. But the staff started getting spooked too. The waiters kept whispering about seeing a tiny, fast-moving shadow darting between the empty tables late at night after closing, always hovering near the parking lot where the taxi was kept. I told myself it was just some local street urchin trying to steal leftover food. So to shut everyone up, I went out and bought a dog. Not just any dog, this massive, fully grown black dog. A real guard dog. I chained him up right next to the bamboo thicket, directly facing the front hood of the taxi, figuring his barking would scare off any trespassers. The first couple of nights were fine, but on the third night, I had already gone home to my house a few miles away, leaving my manager, Kyle, to sleep on a cot in the back room to watch the property. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone started ringing off the hook. It was Kyle, and he sounded absolutely hysterical. He was demanding that I drive over right that second with the car keys. I was groggy and pissed off, asking him what his problem was, and he just kept screaming that the dog was inside the car. I thought he was out of his mind. I had the only set of keys. The car was manually locked. I drove over there, breaking the speed limit, and when I pulled into the dark lot, I could hear it. The muffled, frantic scratching, and this high-pitched, pathetic whimpering echoing from inside the taxi. I ran over with my flashlight. The heavy metal chain was still securely attached to the tree, but the collar was empty, sitting perfectly unbuckled on the gravel. I shined the light through the car window, and my blood ran cold. The dog was trapped inside the locked cabin, and it was losing its freaking mind. It had completely shredded the synthetic leather of the back seats, tearing the foam out in clumps. There was dog piss and feces smeared all over the windows, the dashboard, the floor mats. The poor animal had literally evacuated its bowels in sheer, unadulterated terror. When I finally fumbled with the keys and popped the door open, the stench of ammonia and hot panic hit me like a physical punch. The dog didn't even run at first. It practically crawled out of the door on its belly, shivering so hard its teeth were chattering, keeping its body pressed flat to the dirt. It scurried about 30 feet away, stopped, and then slowly turned around to stare at the empty car, whining this low, guttural sound that I will never forget. I spent 3 hours scrubbing feces out of the upholstery, cursing my luck, cursing Kyle, cursing the dog, doing everything in my power to avoid asking the one question that mattered. How the hell did a 70-pound dog unbuckle its own collar, unlock a sealed car door, climb inside, and lock it from the inside? I know how crazy this sounds. I really do. I know you're probably thinking I was an idiot for keeping that car. But you have to understand the grip of poverty. When you owe money to everyone you know, your survival instinct overrides your sanity. I couldn't afford to junk the car. I needed it to work. But the entity, whatever was in that vehicle, it hated the dog. A few days later, the staff found the dog whimpering under the rear axle of the taxi. Somehow, the parking brake had disengaged. The car had rolled backward on the flat gravel, and the heavy tire had completely crushed the dog's back leg. It was a sickening, unnatural injury. The dog barely lasted another week. It just stopped eating, laid in the dirt staring at the car, and eventually died right there on the end of its chain, its tongue hanging out in the heat. And I'm not proud of this, but times were desperate. Back then, in some older rural communities in the north, there was still this rugged mindset of never letting any meat go to waste. We butchered it. The kitchen staff cooked it up into a 7-course meal. Looking back now, eating the flesh of an animal that was literally tortured to death by a ghost feels like some kind of sick karma, but at the time, it was just another Tuesday. After the dog died, the bad luck just completely suffocated me. The restaurant went from 5 tables a week to 0. Literally 0. I would sit there on a Saturday night, prime time, and not a single soul would walk through the gates. I was forced to drive the taxi 7 days a week just to pay the interest on my loans. But the car was a weapon. I'd be driving down a straight, empty road, and the steering wheel would physically jerk out of my hands, just violently snap to the right, forcing me into a ditch. I had to pay out of pocket to fix a fence I destroyed. I'd get pulled over by traffic cops who swore I didn't use my turn signals, even though I was sitting there with the blinker clicking loudly in the cabin, completely invisible to the outside world. I woke up one morning to find all 4 tires slashed. No, not slashed, just completely deflated. The valves had been unscrewed and laid neatly on the pavement. I was losing my mind. My wife was threatening to take the kids and leave. My parents were furious that I had squandered their land. I was a cornered animal. So, I resorted to the most desperate tactic in the taxi playbook, the graveyard shift at the provincial hospital. I figured I could park outside the emergency room at 1 or 2 a.m., waiting for those desperate, high-paying fares, people taking bodies home or rushing back to a village in the middle of the night. You just recline your seat, crack the window, and pray for blind luck. The first 2 nights out there were pure psychological torture. I was exhausted, hovering in that weird space between sleep and waking when I kept hearing this sound. Heh, heh, heh. Just a soft, breathy giggle coming from the back seat. I'd snap awake, heart hammering against my ribs, throwing my arm back to turn on the dome light, but there was nothing. Just the shredded foam of the seats staring back at me. I kept telling myself it was the wind blowing through the cracked window, or just my brain misfiring from the stress. But then came the third night. It was pushing 3 a.m. I hadn't gotten a single fare. I had just bought a cheap bowl of midnight noodles from a street cart, eaten it on the hood of the car, and climbed back into the driver's seat. I cranked the seat all the way back so I was practically lying down, staring up at the yellow glow of the streetlights filtering through the windshield. I had a wooden toothpick in my mouth, just idly picking at my teeth, wallowing in my own misery. The hospital parking lot was dead quiet until the temperature in the cabin just plummeted like a meat freezer. And right as I was hit by this thick, nauseating stench of old copper and wet garbage, I heard this wet, bubbling choking sound, almost like someone gargling through a mouthful of thick sludge, coming directly from the passenger seat right next to my ear. I froze. My lungs completely locked up. The toothpick slipped out of my numb lips and fell onto my chest. I didn't want to look. Every single survival instinct I had screaming at me to close my eyes, to open the door and run blindly. But human morbid curiosity is a curse. I slowly turned my head to the right, toward the passenger seat. He was sitting right there. It was the little bald boy Haley had seen. But he wasn't a normal kid. His clothes were shredded, soaked in this thick blackish red sludge, and the entire right side of his skull was just gone. Caved in. A mess of bone and dark tissue completely flattening his profile. He was sitting cross-legged on the seat, his unbroken eye staring completely unblinking directly into my face. And he just kept letting out that gargling, choking laugh, the sound bubbling up through the blood in his throat. I didn't even scream. I just completely lost my mind. I threw my entire body weight against the driver's side door, practically tumbling out onto the concrete pavement, scraping my hands raw. I scrambled to my feet and just ran. I abandoned the car with the keys in the ignition, the door wide open, and sprinted blindly across the dark street until I collapsed near a 24-hour rice stall, hyperventilating so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. The vendor thought I was a junkie having a bad trip. I didn't care. I called my wife from a payphone, crying like a child, and made her pick me up. I never drove that car again. I sent Kyle to retrieve it the next morning in the daylight. I spent the next few days aggressively tracking down the original owner, demanding to know the truth, and eventually, a relative of his broke down and confessed. A year prior, the previous owner had been driving through a busy market street. A little 4-year-old boy, overly hyper, had violently ripped his hand away from his mother's grip and sprinted directly out into the traffic. The car didn't even have time to brake. It didn't hit him with the bumper. The kid slipped perfectly under the chassis, and the heavy front passenger tire rolled directly over his skull. Because there were no dents on the bodywork, the owner managed to scrub the undercarriage, bribe a mechanic, and sell it off out of province with a clean record to some unsuspecting idiot. Me. I was the idiot. I sold the car to a scrap dealer for a fraction of what I paid. I took a massive financial loss, but I felt this overwhelming wave of relief watching that cursed piece of metal get towed away. I thought the nightmare was over. I thought my life could finally go back to normal. But that's the thing about the paranormal that completely shatters any logic I ever had. You'd think selling the object would get rid of the attachment, right? Nope. The car was gone, but the ghost of that little boy stayed behind. It was like a parasite had detached itself from the vehicle and burrowed straight into the soil of my family's land. The restaurant staff started quitting one by one. They were terrified. They kept seeing the shadow of a mangled little boy sprinting through the bamboo bushes in the garden, running between the empty tables in the dead of night, giggling in the dark. It ruined everything. The restaurant officially went bankrupt. I had to sell off the commercial fridges, the plastic tables, the fairy lights, everything for pennies on the dollar. My wife screamed at me for ruining our finances. My parents disowned me for a year, furious that I had turned their valuable real estate into literal dead space. No one in town would eat there, and sure as hell, no one would buy the land. It became known as the local ghost lot. It took years of financial ruin and a professional exorcism by a high-ranking monk to finally clear the land enough so my parents could sell it to an out-of-town developer. They gave me a tiny sliver of the profit, barely enough to pay off my lingering debts. To this day, if we're at a family gathering and some oblivious relative jokingly suggests I should open another restaurant or start driving a taxi again, I see absolute red. I will literally flip the table and scream at them until my throat bleeds. They think it's just my bruised ego from a failed business. They don't understand that they are casually joking about the entity that dismantled my sanity piece by piece. And honestly, it makes my stomach drop every time I think about who bought that car from the scrap dealer. Did they fix it up? Is someone else driving it right now? If you take anything away from my family's total collapse, let it be this. If someone is offering you a used car for a price that seems too good to be true, and it has a spotless record, do yourself a favor and walk away. Driving an 18-wheeler across Australia isn't exactly a glamorous job. It's mostly just you, the heavy hum of the diesel engine, and thousands of miles of absolutely nothing. I've spent half my life in that cabin, and I'm the kind of guy who only believes in what's sitting right in front of his headlights. People talk about highway ghosts and weird sightings out in the bush, but I always chalked it up to sleep deprivation, just the brain playing tricks when you've been staring at the endless white lines for 12 hours straight. I really, really wish it was just my brain playing tricks that night. But what I saw was as real as the heavy leather steering wheel, tightly gripped in my sweating hands. This happened about 10 years ago, when I was doing a massive haul of tomatoes from a remote farm all the way to a processing plant, which was roughly a 1,000-kilometer stretch across the country. Now, the law down there is pretty strict about these extreme long-haul routes, and it dictates that for any trip over 1,000 kilometers, you absolutely must have a co-driver in the cab with you to swap shifts and keep things safe. But things were screwed up from the start, because both of the usual guys I partnered with had emergencies and bailed on me at the absolute last second. I sat there in the sweltering midday heat, smelling the sweet heavy scent of overripe tomatoes baking in the cargo trailer, and I just made a really stupid, arrogant decision. I figured, what the heck, I'll just run it solo. I told myself that the absolute worst case scenario was getting pulled over by the highway patrol and eating a fine of maybe $100 or $200, which seemed like a totally fair trade-off for not losing the massive shipping contract. I fired up the rig right around noon and hit the freeway, feeling pretty confident as the miles just melted away under my tires. The plan was smooth until I started approaching Melbourne, Victoria, a sprawling coastal city where the concrete highways just seemed to tangle into endless, frustrating knots of traffic. By the time I hit the outskirts, it was already past 7 or 8 at night, and the heavy, crushing fatigue of driving a beast of a machine for 8 hours straight was really starting to settle behind my eyes. I was just looking for a clear stretch to maybe pull over and catch an hour of sleep, but as soon as I merged onto the main bypass, traffic just stopped dead. I'm talking a complete parking lot. Way up ahead, I could see the flashing blue and red strobes painting the concrete barriers, and it looked like a massive, horrific pileup involving 3 different semi-trucks that had essentially jackknifed and completely barricaded all the lanes. I rolled my window down, and the deafening thwump 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 of medical evacuation helicopters beating the night air just echoed over the endless sea of idling cars. I knew right then and there I was going to be stuck for hours. I felt this rising tide of frustration and anxiety, so I reached over and grabbed my old clunky sat-nav device. This was years before everyone had fancy smart maps on their phones, and started desperately scrolling around the digital terrain looking for a way out. That's when I noticed a thin gray line diverging off the main interstate just a few miles back, labeled as an old provincial highway that eventually reconnected to my route about 40 miles further down. It looked like an old, forgotten artery from before the massive modern bypass was built. I didn't even hesitate. I managed to painfully maneuver my massive rig in a wide, illegal U-turn across the grass median, ignoring the angry honks from the cars behind me, and I pointed my headlights toward that old off-ramp. The moment my tires transitioned from the smooth interstate asphalt to the cracked, rough surface of that old highway, the entire atmosphere just shifted. It was like driving straight into a black hole. There were absolutely no streetlights, no reflective markers on the shoulder, and zero signs of human life. It was just an impossibly straight, narrow road, completely swallowed by towering, dense forests on both sides. The isolation was suffocating. Even the sat-nav seemed to realize how wrong this was, because the robotic female voice started aggressively commanding me to return to the route, over and over again. The mechanical return, echoing so loudly in the quiet cab that I actually got pissed off and aggressively reached over to rip the power cord right out of the dashboard. With the silence returning to the cab, the road hypnosis began to set in rapidly. There was absolutely nothing to focus my eyes on except the small patch of illuminated asphalt in front of me, and it felt like I was floating in a terrible video game where the scenery just endlessly looped. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. To fight off the creeping sleep, I started deliberately swerving the massive truck slightly left and right, throwing my blinkers on for imaginary lane changes just to keep my limbs moving and my brain engaged, and that's when the swinging started. For years, I had this large, heavy wooden rosary hanging from my rearview mirror. A priest back home gave it to me for protection on the road, and I usually never paid any attention to it, but on this dead, uneven road, the constant vibrations of the truck caused the wooden beads to start swaying back and forth in a wide, rhythmic arc, making a soft but persistent clack, clack, clack sound against the windshield glass. Because the road was so utterly devoid of any visual stimulation, my exhausted eyes kept getting drawn to that swinging pendulum in my peripheral vision. It was literally hypnotizing me, pulling me deeper into a daze, and I felt this sudden, intense wave of nausea and dizziness wash over me. I aggressively grabbed the rosary, yanked it off the mirror, and without even taking my eyes off the road, I reached my arm backward into the sleeper cab behind my seat and dropped it onto the small 12-inch folding table. It was just a flimsy little tray I used for eating instant noodles on long hauls. I heard the heavy wooden cross hit the plastic surface with a dull thud, and I let out a deep breath, trying to focus back on the empty blackness ahead. It couldn't have been more than 60 seconds later. I was cruising at maybe 50 or 60 miles per hour, my high beams cutting a long, harsh cone of light through the dark, when I noticed something hovering on the distant right shoulder. It was just a pale, faint shape, contrasting sharply against the pitch-black wall of the forest. I immediately eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the engine brake engage as my mind struggled to process what the hell I was looking at. A stray animal? A piece of trash blown by the wind? As the distance closed to about 100 feet, the pale shape resolved into a human figure. My heart did a violent stutter in my chest. You have to understand, seeing a pedestrian out here, miles from civilization on an abandoned road in the middle of the night, is enough to make any driver's blood run completely cold. I slowed down to a crawl, maybe 20 miles per hour, my headlights washing over her. It was an old woman. She had to be at least 80 or 90 years old, frail and incredibly hunched over. She was wearing a loose, light blue nightgown that fluttered weakly in the draft of my truck, and her shock of curly, pure white hair practically glowed in the headlights. The most bizarre detail, the thing my brain just instantly locked onto, was the thick reading glasses resting on her chest, attached to one of those beaded lanyards around her neck. She was completely barefoot, stepping onto the rough, debris-filled asphalt, slowly and deliberately walking across the highway, right into my path. My initial, desperate thought was that this was a trap. Some sketchy guys using an old lady with dementia to force trucks to stop so they could hijack the cargo. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I hovered my foot over the gas pedal, fully prepared to floor it and plow through whatever ambush was waiting in the dark. But as I rolled closer, practically idling now, she continued her slow, agonizing shuffle across the lanes. Then, she reached the center median. The concrete divider on this old road was massive, designed to block out high-beam glare from oncoming traffic, making it easily 5 feet tall. A normal, healthy adult would have to aggressively scramble and pull themselves up to get over it. But this frail, hunched-over grandmother, she didn't climb. She just gracefully, effortlessly floated upward, One second she was standing on the asphalt, and the next second she executed this impossible, gravity-defying vault, landing perfectly seated right on top of the narrow concrete wall. Her movements were so incredibly fluid and silent, completely devoid of any physical exertion. As I slowly rolled past her, she was sitting there on the wall, her body positioned perfectly parallel to my windshield, and as my massive truck loomed over her, she slowly turned her head, looking straight up into my cabin. Her skin was a pale, sickening shade of porcelain, completely devoid of life, and she smiled. It wasn't a malicious grin, just a soft, polite, almost welcoming smile, and she slowly raised one bony hand and gave me a gentle, casual wave hello, as if we were passing each other in a grocery store aisle. I slammed my foot on the gas, my breathing turning into shallow, desperate gasps. I stared frantically into my rear-view mirror, expecting to see her sitting there in the red glow of my taillights, but the concrete median was completely empty. She was just gone. My brain completely short-circuited. I started loudly talking to myself, aggressively trying to rationalize what I just saw, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just a combination of exhaustion and highway hypnosis. I told myself that the old woman didn't actually jump, that I just blinked and missed her climbing up. I was trying so desperately to gaslight my own sanity because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. I pushed the truck up to a nervous 50 miles per hour, my eyes darting frantically to every shadow in the trees. Maybe 40 seconds passed. Less than a mile of road. Suddenly, my headlights caught movement on the left side of the road, right by the center median. I panicked. I slammed both feet onto the brake pedal so aggressively that the tires locked up, screeching and smoking against the pavement, throwing my entire body forward violently as the seatbelt dug deep into my collarbone, bruising the skin. The massive rig shuddered and groaned, coming down to a slow, creeping roll. It was her, the exact same old woman in the blue nightgown, but this time, she was walking away from the median, heading back toward the dark forest on the right side of the road. I was trembling so violently I could barely keep my foot steady on the brake. I just slowly rolled forward, my high beams tracking her as she crossed the massive expanse of the 4-lane highway. She moved with that same agonizingly slow, shuffling gait, her bare feet making no sound on the pavement. I watched, completely paralyzed by this primal, suffocating terror, as she reached the wooden barricade fence separating the road from the trees, a fence that was easily waist-high, and she just effortlessly glided over it in one smooth, unnatural motion, instantly disappearing into the thick black woods. I grabbed my water bottle from the cup holder with shaking hands, spilling half of it down my shirt as I desperately gulped it down. I started loudly reciting the Lord's Prayer, my voice cracking and echoing in the empty cab, begging whatever was up there to protect me from whatever the hell was happening out here. I realized I couldn't stop. Parking on a pitch-black, abandoned highway with that thing out there was a death sentence. I kept the truck moving at an agonizingly slow 20 miles per hour, my eyes wide and burning, constantly scanning the dark. I made it maybe another mile, and then I saw her for the third time. She wasn't on the shoulder. She wasn't by the median. She was right in the middle of the lanes, walking in the exact same direction I was driving, her back turned to me. All the rationalization, all the denial, it just evaporated in an instant. I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that no human being could cover that much ground, jumping back and forth across a massive highway in a matter of seconds. This was something deeply, terribly wrong. A surge of pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. I wasn't going to slow down this time. I aggressively dropped a gear and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The heavy diesel engine roared as I swerved the massive truck into the far left lane, hugging the concrete median as tightly as I physically could to put as much distance between my truck and her as possible. The speedometer climbed. 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. As I blew past her, I instinctively glanced into my right side mirror. She wasn't looking at me. She was just shuffling forward, her back heavily hunched, her arms swinging out wide in this bizarre, unnatural paddling motion. Within 3 seconds, The darkness swallowed her up completely. I was hyperventilating now. My chest felt like it was trapped in a vice. I realized I still had over 20 miles left on this nightmare road before it merged back into civilization, and there was absolutely nowhere to turn around. My panicked brain suddenly remembered the wooden rosary I had tossed onto the table in the sleeper cab. If there was ever a time I needed spiritual protection, it was right fucking now. Without slowing down, I kept my left hand in a death grip on the steering wheel, and I blindly reached my right arm backward between the seats, my hand desperately feeling around the flat, plastic surface of the small folding table. I swiped my hand back and forth, covering every single inch of that tiny 12-inch surface. Nothing. The table was completely empty. A cold spike of dread shot straight down my spine. The table had a raised lip around the edge. There was absolutely no way the heavy rosary could have simply vibrated off, and I knew I hadn't braked hard enough to send it flying forward. It was just gone. The suffocating silence in the cab suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if the air pressure had changed. Every single instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep my eyes on the road, to not look back, to just keep driving until I hit the streetlights of the city. But human curiosity is a deeply flawed, suicidal thing. I slowly turned my head, looking over my right shoulder into the dark, cramped space of the sleeper cabin behind me. She was there. The old woman in the pale blue nightgown was lying perfectly flat on my mattress. Her body was completely rigid, her arms and legs locked completely straight at her sides like a corpse in a casket. Her face was pointed straight up toward the ceiling of the cab, her eyes wide open and unblinking in the ambient shadows. In that fraction of a second, my brain, completely broken by the trauma, obsessively locked onto the fact that her thick reading glasses had slipped sideways across her chest. The beaded lanyard tangled slightly in the cheap fabric of her gown. The sheer, overwhelming horror of sharing that tiny, enclosed space with an entity that defied all laws of nature finally broke me. I let out this guttural, animalistic scream that tore my throat raw, and before my brain could even process the fact that I was driving a 40-ton missile at 70 miles per hour, my vision tunneled into total, absolute blackness. I completely passed out behind the wheel. When consciousness finally dragged me back, the very first thing I registered was a sharp, throbbing pain radiating up through my calves and thighs. I tried to shift my weight, but my legs felt like they had been beaten with a baseball bat. I groaned, slowly opening my crusty, burning eyes. I wasn't in my truck. I was lying on a dusty wooden floor inside what looked like a rustic barn or a storage shed. The smell of old hay, motor oil, and damp wood filled my nose. I was covered in dirt. My clothes were soaked in a cold, stale sweat, and my entire body felt completely drained, as if I had just run a grueling marathon. "Hey, mate, take it easy," a voice suddenly said. I flinched violently, scrambling backward, until my back hit a stack of wooden pallets. Standing a few feet away were a man and a woman, an Aussie couple who looked to be in their mid-40s, both dressed in worn-out flannel and jeans. The woman was holding a steaming mug of hot milk, looking at me with this mixture of deep concern and intense bewilderment. They slowly approached me, handing me the hot mug, and the warmth of the ceramic against my trembling hands grounded me just a little bit. The husband gently asked me who I was and how the hell I managed to wander onto their isolated farm property in the middle of the night. I sat there, sipping the milk, and the memories of the dark highway, the pale blue dress, and the rigid body on my bed came flooding back with sickening clarity. I started rambling, my voice shaking uncontrollably as I explained that I was a truck driver, that I took a detour onto the old highway because of the accident in Melbourne, and that I had seen an impossible old woman before blacking out behind the wheel. The husband and wife exchanged a very long, very heavy look. The husband crossed his arms, his expression turning serious. He told me that the old highway I was talking about had been officially decommissioned and abandoned for over 5 years. Nobody drove on it anymore. And more importantly, he pointed out that the closest edge of their farm property to that old road was over a mile of dense, unforgiving forest terrain. I desperately tried to explain that I didn't walk here, that I had passed out while driving at high speed, and I begged them to help me find my truck because my entire livelihood, my cargo, and all my paperwork were still inside it. The wife quietly excused herself and walked out of the shed toward the main farmhouse. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a medium-sized, black and white photograph. Her hand was trembling slightly as she handed it to me. "Is this the woman you saw?" she asked softly. I looked down at the photograph, and my stomach plummeted into a bottomless void. It was her. The woman in the photo was a bit younger, maybe in her late 60s, dressed in a sharp suit instead of a nightgown, but the facial features, the curly white hair, the shape of her nose, it was undeniably the exact same woman who had been lying on my bed. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my legs, a fresh wave of panic washing over me. I accused them of being involved, asking if they were ghosts too, if this was all some elaborate sick trap. The husband let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. He told me that they weren't ghosts. The woman in the photo was his grandmother. He explained that his grandparents had lived in Melbourne for decades. His grandfather was actually a long-haul trucker back in the day, driving the massive rigs just like I did. And his grandmother, the woman in the photo, used to ride shotgun with him all the time. She was a tough, fiercely independent woman, and even though she never had a commercial license, she absolutely loved driving those massive 18-wheelers on the open road. He told me he still vividly remembered when he was just 7 or 8 years old. Back in the 90s, she would actually drive the massive rig and take him along for local deliveries. When his grandfather passed away, his grandmother's mental health rapidly deteriorated. She developed severe dementia and became obsessed with the idea that her husband was still alive, waiting for her at their old house in Melbourne. They tried putting her in a high-security nursing home, but she constantly managed to escape, wandering the streets trying to find a bus or a train to take her home. The facility eventually kicked her out because the liability was too high. With no other options, the couple brought her out to their isolated farm to care for her. But one night, she slipped out of the house. The police found her the next morning. She had wandered over a mile through the dense woods in the pitch black, somehow finding her way to the old highway. She was wandering in the middle of the lanes, desperately looking for a way back to Melbourne, when a speeding container truck hit her. The police estimated it happened right around 3 or 4 in the morning. I sat there, the hot milk turning to ash in my mouth. I had driven right through the exact spot where she was killed, on a road she still desperately haunted. And the most messed up part was what the husband told me next. After the police released her body from the hospital, they didn't bury her in some public cemetery. They actually brought her back and buried her right there on that very farm. After I managed to calm down, he offered to drive me in his pickup truck to go look for my rig, and honestly, I was terrified of what we would find out there, fully expecting a mangled wreck wrapped around a tree and my career completely destroyed. We drove out of the farm, navigating this small dirt service road that eventually connected to the abandoned highway. As his headlights swept across the cracked asphalt, my jaw absolutely dropped. My massive 40-ton 18-wheeler was sitting there perfectly in the dark. It hadn't crashed, and it hadn't rolled into the ditch. The huge rig was flawlessly, perfectly parallel, parked flush against the shoulder of the road. The engine was turned off, the parking brake was securely engaged, and there wasn't a single scratch on the bumper. You have to understand the physics of driving an old container truck. It has a manual transmission with a heavy foot clutch, meaning if you pass out and simply take your feet off the pedals, the truck doesn't just coast to a stop. It violently stalls out, jerking and buckling right there in the middle of the road. To pull a rig that size safely to the side requires intense focus, calculated downshifting, and multiple wide steering corrections. It is physically impossible for an unconscious man to execute that maneuver. The husband turned to me, his face looking completely pale in the dashboard light, and quietly reminded me that his grandmother used to love driving those trucks. The horrifying realization finally clicked into place. When I passed out, the entity, the spirit of that old woman, had completely overtaken my body. She used my hands, my feet, my physical form to smoothly press the clutch, downshift the gears, safely park the massive rig on the shoulder, and turn off the engine. And then she literally walked my exhausted body over a mile through the dark woods, bringing me straight back to her family's farm. She didn't want to hurt me. She just needed a ride, and then she needed to go back to her grave. I thanked the couple profusely, my voice choked with a mixture of terror and profound gratitude. The husband told me to be safe, and casually asked if I had a cross or a rosary in the truck, suggesting I hold onto it for the rest of the drive just in case. I told him I did, but that I had lost it during the panic. I walked up to my truck, my legs still trembling from the mile-long possession walk. I opened the heavy metal door, climbed up into the driver's seat, and flicked on the interior cabin light. I slowly turned around to look at the sleeper cab. Sitting directly in the dead center of the small 12-inch folding table, the exact same table I had blindly, frantically swept my hands across without feeling a single thing, was my wooden rosary. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't moved. She had simply, effortlessly hidden it from my touch because she wasn't ready to leave the truck yet. I grabbed the heavy wooden beads, wrapping them so tightly around my knuckles that it hurt, and I fired up the engine. I drove the rest of the way to the processing plant with every single light inside the cab turned on, jumping at every shadow, checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds. A few days later, after dropping off the cargo, the memory of that family's kindness nagged at me, and I made the decision to take the old highway back to try and find their farm to thank them properly in the daylight. But when I reached the turnoff from the interstate, the entrance was completely blocked. A solid, impenetrable wall of massive concrete barriers had been installed across the ramp, accompanied by bright orange signs declaring the road permanently closed. I sat there in the idling truck, staring at those concrete blocks, realizing the terrifying precision of the universe. If my co-drivers hadn't bailed, if the traffic hadn't jammed, if I had been delayed by even a single day, I would have never taken that road. I would never have seen her. It was a perfect, inescapable alignment of circumstances designed exclusively for me to cross paths with a dead woman still trying to find her way home. If your college dorm has an abandoned room that management never bothers to padlock, request a transfer immediately. I thought I was just being paranoid back in my freshman year, but I swear to you, some doors are left unlocked for a reason. I'm going to keep the exact name of the university out of this. Just because the school is still operating, the dorms are still packed with students, and I really don't want to start some massive panic for the kids living there right now. But I can tell you it was located in Govap, this massively crowded district in Saigon, where the alleys are a total maze and the airplanes fly so low you can literally feel them shake the roof. Back in 2013, I was just a freshman. I came from a smaller province, so my parents naturally forced me to live in the campus dorms. You know how it is. Parents think if you're on campus, you're safe, you're managed, you won't get into trouble. The campus itself was huge, but the actual dormitory building was surprisingly cramped. It was just this single tall building, maybe 10 stories high, but the weird part was how they divided it. They split the entire building right down the middle to separate the guys from the girls. I'm talking 2 separate entrances, 2 separate parking lots, 2 separate cafeterias. Down in the parking garage, there was a solid brick wall dividing us. But up in the actual living quarters, it was just a heavy-duty chain-link fence. Like, they painted it to look nice, but it was just a thick metal fence running right down the middle of the hallway to make absolutely sure the guys and girls couldn't mix. I was assigned to room 27. Because of how the math worked out with the hallway being chopped in half, our room was at the absolute dead end of the boys' side. And directly across the hall from us, separated only by a few feet of tiled floor, was room 14, the dead end of the girls' side. There were 4 of us shoved into this tiny room. None of us were from the Mekong Delta, which is kind of rare for students in the city. I had a buddy from Dong Nai, one from Kon Tum, one from Quang Nam, and I was from Bin Tuong. For the sake of this story, since I'm trying to protect their privacy too, let's just call them Victor, Nolan, and Caleb. The first few days were fine. It was actually really fun, just that chaotic, loud energy of a bunch of guys living away from home for the first time. But after a few weeks, everyone settled into their routines. People started skipping classes, going to work, going home for the weekend. So during the day, the dorm would actually get incredibly empty. Like maybe 10% of the students were actually around. It was about a month into the semester. I was feeling a little under the weather. Nothing serious, just that heavy, lethargic feeling where you absolutely cannot be bothered to sit in a lecture hall. I tried to convince the other guys to skip class with me and play some League of Legends, but they actually went to class, leaving me totally alone in the room. It was right around noon. Our room didn't have AC, just this ceiling fan that basically just pushed the hot, humid air around in a circle. It was stifling. So, instead of sitting on my top bunk where the air was completely dead, I grabbed this cheap plastic folding table we used for eating, set it on the floor, and sat cross-legged against the frame of the bunk bed. The way I was sitting, I was facing our open doorway, and if I just lifted my eyes slightly over the top of my laptop screen, I was looking directly into the open doorway of room 14 across the hall. Now, room 14 had been empty since the day we moved in. Nobody lived there, but for some screwed-up reason, it was never actually locked. The main door and the window facing the hallway were always just closed, but never padlocked. Every now and then, I'd see the security guard come upstairs, grab the handle, and pull it shut with this loud metallic clack, but he never used a key. I always assumed maybe the girls next door were using it to store stuff or something. I don't know. Anyway, I was in the middle of a match. I'm just staring at my screen, sweating in the midday heat, totally absorbed in the game. You know how League works. When your character gets killed, you have this respawn timer where you literally can't do anything for like 15 or 20 seconds. So my character died. I leaned my head back against the metal bed frame, stretched my neck, and just casually glanced across the hall. The door to room 14 was wide open. I didn't really think much of it. The room inside was pitch black because they didn't have their lights on, which was normal since the building's design blocked out almost all natural sunlight. I just figured the guard forgot to close it. I went back to my game. A few minutes later, I messed up and died again. I sighed, looked up from the screen, and my stomach just did this weird slow flip. There was a girl in the room. I could see her silhouette moving around in the dark. She was dressed totally normal, like a college student who just got back from class, wearing a light jacket, long pants. I watched her take off a helmet and hang it on the wall. At least, that's what it looked like she was doing. I honestly just thought, oh, okay. I guess someone finally moved into the empty room. My game pinged, pulling my attention back. I played for another 5 minutes, died again, and looked back up. She was still in there, still pacing back and forth in the dark. But there was something incredibly heavy about her. Even from across the hall, I could feel this suffocating sadness radiating off her. Her head was bowed down, her shoulders slumped, like someone who just got dumped or failed out of school. I kept watching her, completely forgetting about my game, and the longer I watched, the more my brain started to reject what I was seeing. She was pantomiming. She would walk up to a spot where a desk should be, reach out her hand, and make the exact motion of picking up a water bottle, but her hand was empty. Then she'd walk to another corner, reach down, and pretend to lift a heavy pot or a plant, but there was nothing there. She was just gliding around the dark room, touching invisible objects, going through the motions of a life that wasn't there. I actually kind of chuckled to myself, trying to brush it off, thinking she was just some weird theater kid practicing a routine. I watched her slowly turn and walk into the room's ensuite bathroom. She pulled the door shut behind her, and then she just never turned the bathroom light on. I sat there staring at that closed bathroom door for I don't even know how long. Why would you go into a windowless bathroom in a dark room and not turn on the light? About 20 minutes later, the security guard came shuffling down the hall. He stopped at room 14, peeked inside, grabbed the door handle, and slammed it shut. Then he reached over and slammed the window shut, latching both of them from the outside. I just sat there, frozen. He locked the room. He locked the room from the outside, and that girl never came out of the bathroom. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was from room 13 and just snuck over to use the spare toilet because hers was occupied, and maybe she slipped out while I was looking at my screen. You have to understand, your brain will do anything to avoid admitting there's a ghost 10 feet away from where you sleep. I eventually closed my laptop, too creeped out to stay alone, and left the dorm to hang out at an internet cafe until the other guys got back. Late that afternoon, Victor came sprinting into our room. He was out of breath, clutching this stiff, cheap, brand new blanket he'd obviously just bought from the market downstairs. He threw it on the floor and frantically started telling us that we could absolutely not look across the hall anymore. We asked him what the hell he was talking about, and he explained that he was just talking to some upperclassmen. Apparently, when the dorm was first built about 3 years prior, in 2010, it had barely been open for a month when a girl hanged herself inside room 14. Victor told us the school administration hushed it up immediately. They had police come in the middle of the night, completely scrubbed the incident from the records, and threatened the staff to keep their mouths shut because they couldn't afford a mass exodus of students leaving for off-campus housing. Hearing Victor explain that, I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I practically choked on my own spit as I told them about the girl I watched pantomiming in the dark just a few hours earlier, the one who walked into the bathroom and never came out. We were terrified. We immediately helped Victor string up that cheap blanket across our doorway to block the view of room 14. But of course, a couple of days later, the dorm management did their rounds and forced us to take it down, citing fire hazards and aesthetic rules, so the view was wide open again. Now, Victor believed me, but Caleb was our resident skeptic. He didn't outright mock me, but he made it very clear he thought I was just seeing shadows or making up crap because I was bored. He fully believed a girl died there, sure, but he absolutely refused to believe her spirit was still pacing around. But then, a few nights later, it happened to Nolan. Nolan had the bed right next to our window, which perfectly paralleled the window of room 14. We always kept our window open at night because the building had a central air shaft that let a breeze through. Nolan told us the next morning, looking physically sick, that he had woken up in the dead of night, needing to use the restroom. He sat up, totally groggy, rubbing his eyes, and as he turned to swing his legs out of bed, he looked out the window. He said the light in room 14's bathroom was on. He stared at it, confused, because the main room was pitch black. And he told us that as he was looking, a hand reached out from inside the brightly lit bathroom. He specifically described it as bone white, unnaturally pale, with long, thin fingers. It reached around the doorframe, grabbed the handle, and slowly pulled the bathroom door shut. He even heard the distinct click of the latch. Nolan said he instantly dove back under his covers, completely ignoring his need to pee, and lay there shivering until the sun came up. He begged us to switch beds with him, but honestly, none of us were brave enough to take the window spot after that. We told him to just pitch in, to buy a couple of cheap desk fans, so we could permanently close our window at night. At this point, 3 of us were actively trying to get the dorm management to move us to a different room, but the dorms were at maximum capacity. There was a waiting list, and worse, Caleb was actively fighting against us moving. He claimed he liked our spot at the end of the hall because it was quieter, but we all knew the real reason. He had his eye on a couple of girls in room 12 and 13, and being at our end of the hall meant he got to see them walk by every single day. He told us we were being paranoid idiots, that if the ghost was really that bad, the whole building would be empty. He kept saying that her family probably performed a ritual to take her spirit back to her hometown, so there was nothing to worry about. He was so arrogant about it. I really wish he hadn't been. The third incident happened to Victor. He had a girlfriend who went to a different university, and since the 4 of us were always making noise in the room, he would usually step out into the hallway around 9 or 10 p.m. to call her. He told us he was sitting against the wall just outside our door, talking to his girl. The hallway was busy at first, people walking to the showers, kids yelling across the fence, but eventually, it quieted down. Victor was looking down at his phone, deeply engaged in conversation, when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Down at the absolute opposite end of the hallway near room 1 and the main stairwell, a girl was walking toward him. He told us he didn't think anything of it. Lots of girls took night classes and came back late. She was walking normally, hugging a binder to her chest. He kept talking on the phone, occasionally glancing up. She walked past room 1, room 2, room 3. Just a slow, steady, quiet pace. But as she got closer to our end of the hallway was completely dead. No one else was around. Victor said that when she passed room 12, his chest started to feel tight. When she passed room 13, completely ignoring the open doors and the light spilling into the hallway, his instincts started screaming at him. He said his legs literally locked up. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't speak into his phone. He just watched in absolute silence. The girl reached room 14. She turned, pushed the closed door open effortlessly, walked inside, went straight to the bathroom, and pulled the door shut behind her with that same metallic clack. Victor dropped his phone, scrambled backward on his hands and knees, and practically threw himself into our room, pale as a ghost. He begged Caleb to agree to move, but Caleb still refused. He just laughed at Victor, calling him a coward, saying we were all feeding into each other's delusions. And that brings us to the Saturday night. It was someone's birthday. I honestly can't even remember whose. The fear of what happened completely erased those details. We bought a cheap cake, some snacks, and a case of beer. Because we were drinking, we had our door and window wide open to air out the smell. Nolan, Victor, and I explicitly positioned ourselves so our backs were facing the door. We wanted to look into our room, not out into the hallway, but Caleb, sitting right in the middle of us, faced the door head on. He was looking directly into the dark, open space of the hallway, and directly at the closed door of room 14. We had been drinking for about an hour. It was getting late, maybe past 10 p.m. We were all a little buzzed. Suddenly, Caleb smirks, points his beer can toward the hallway, and says, loud enough for anyone to hear, that our little ghost friend was opening her door. My heart stopped. We all slowly turned our heads. The door to room 14 was wide open. Victor stammered, asking Caleb if he actually saw someone open it. Caleb just scoffed, took a sip of his beer, and said it was probably just the wind blowing it open. But I had watched the guard lock that door. I knew it wasn't the wind. We begged Caleb to stop joking around, to show some respect, but he just told us to shut up and keep drinking. About 10 minutes later, Victor whispered that the door was closed again. We looked, and sure enough, it was shut tight. No sound, no wind, just soot. We tried to focus on the beers, but maybe 20 minutes later, I noticed Caleb stopped talking. I looked at him. He was in the middle of bringing his beer to his mouth, but he had frozen completely solid. I need to explain exactly how wrong he looked right then, because it's burned into my memory. He didn't drop his drink. He just held it halfway to his face, his eyes blown wide open, staring directly past me and into the hallway. I watched the condensation from his cold beer gather into a thick drop, slide down the aluminum can, and drip onto his jeans, but he didn't even flinch. His jaw was slack. He wasn't blinking. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Nolan waved a hand in front of his face, asking if he was too drunk. Caleb didn't look at us. Without moving his eyes, he slowly tilted his entire upper body backward, shrinking away from the doorway, and in this impossibly thin, trembling voice, he told us to close the door. He didn't yell. He begged, "Close the door." Nolan scrambled up and slammed our main door shut, throwing the deadbolt. Victor locked the window. We grabbed Caleb, shaking him, asking what the hell he saw. He was hyperventilating, clutching his chest like he was having a heart attack. He kept muttering that it was real, that we were right, over and over again. When he finally caught his breath, he told us that he saw the bathroom door inside room 14 open. He saw the pale hand, and then he saw her step out. He said she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair hanging down in long, wet strands over her face. She stepped out of the bathroom, turned her head slowly, and locked eyes directly with him through the open doors. Then, she raised her hand and pointed a single long finger right at his face. Caleb said she started moving toward him, but her legs weren't moving. She was just gliding, hovering inches above the tile floor, pointing directly at his eyes, getting closer and closer to our doorway. He said the moment she reached the threshold of our room, her face twisted into something horrific. She vanished into thin air, and the door to room 14 slowly swung shut on its own. Caleb was completely broken. This guy who spent weeks mocking us was now curled up on his bunk, refusing to speak, refusing to look anywhere but the ceiling. He told us he was ready to move. He said he would go to the office first thing in the morning and beg them. We tried to calm him down. We told him the door was locked, that we were safe. Eventually, exhaustion and the alcohol took over, and we all passed out in our bunks. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe around 3:15 a.m., but I woke up needing to use the restroom. I groggily climbed down from my top bunk, went into our small attached bathroom, did my business, and stepped back out. I hadn't turned the bathroom light off yet, so it was casting this long, pale yellow beam across the dark room. The light fell directly onto Caleb's top bunk. My breath hitched in my throat. Holy fucking shit. Caleb was sitting up, but the ceiling was so low that he couldn't sit straight. He was sitting completely cross-legged, his neck bent at this agonizing, unnatural 90-degree angle, with the top of his head pressed flat against the ceiling plaster. He wasn't looking at the wall. He had his head tilted sideways, staring directly down at me in the dark, and he was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was this wide, strained, ear-to-ear grin that didn't reach his dead, empty eyes. And while he stared at me, his hand was moving through the air next to his head, making slow, rhythmic sweeping motions. It was brushing invisible, waist-length hair. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward against the bathroom door, my foot kicking a metal trash can. The noise was deafening in the quiet room. Victor and Nolan instantly woke up, panicked by the noise. They fumbled for the main light switch and flipped it on. The harsh fluorescent light hit Caleb. He instantly collapsed sideways onto his mattress, gasping for air like someone who had just been pulled underwater. We scrambled up the ladder, shaking him violently. He looked at us with complete confusion, his eyes darting around the room. We asked him what the hell he was doing sitting like that, brushing his hair and smiling at me in the dark. He looked at us, totally blank, and said he was just sleeping. He said he was having a nice dream, where a girl from across the hall was holding his hand and taking him for a walk in the dark. We didn't let him sleep for the rest of the night. We pulled him down to the floor, turned every light on, and forced him to talk to us until the sun finally came up. We were genuinely terrified that if he closed his eyes again, whatever was hollowing out his mind would finish the job and he wouldn't wake up as Caleb anymore. The moment the gates opened at 6 a.m., we practically dragged him out of the dorm and walked him to a large Buddhist temple nearby. He walked like a zombie the whole way, dragging his feet, staring blankly at the pavement. It wasn't until he sat in the main hall of the temple for 3 hours, surrounded by the chanting and the incense, that the heavy fog seemed to finally lift from his eyes, and he realized what had actually happened. We never went back to that room to sleep. We pooled our money, chipping in a few $100,000 dong, maybe $20 each, which was a lot for us back then, and rented a dingy motel room down the street for a week while we fought with the administration to reassign us. Eventually, they split us up and shoved us into other overcrowded rooms just to shut us up. I ended up staying there, finishing my degree, and eventually moving back to my hometown to work. But honestly, I have no idea if that girl's spirit ever actually moved on, or if she's still just trapped there. A few years later, I actually had to go back to the university to pick up some paperwork, and I decided to swing by the old dorms to check on some underclassmen I knew. They told me that both room 14 and room 27 are just completely gone now. Like the kids living on that floor today don't even know the room numbers anymore. All they know is that at the absolute dead end of the hallway, there are just two heavy, unmarked storage doors facing each other in the dark.